Welcome to the ultimate Next.js crash course. In this free video, I will take you from zero to Next.js hero in only 3 hours.
Nice.
Wondering what exactly we are going to cover? Well, we will build a block management system where users can sign up, create blog posts, view them in the dashboard, see them on the homepage, and check them out on the individual routes. Along the way, we will uncover tons of Next.js magic, covering everything from the basics like routing, server components, client components, to more advanced topics like, for example, streaming and caching. Want to know exactly what we are going to learn? Well, here's a list of everything. As you see, a lot of knowledge packed into 3 hours. So now, are you ready to level up and become a Next.js master? I hope so. So now, without any further ado, it's time to roll the video. Let's go! Alright friends, so I'm currently at Next.js.org, and the first question which you should have right now is, what even is Next.js and why should I use it? So Next.js is a meta framework built on top of React. React, as you all know, is an UI library. At the end of the day, this React library allows us to build very complex, very scalable, very fast UI. But the problem with React is we don't get any helpers. We don't get any batteries included. Metadata? It's kinda hard. Server rendering? Yeah, probably not. There are a lot of things which are quite hard, and Next.js takes all of the benefits of React and makes them even better, because at the end of the day, Next.js includes very cool benefits like built-in optimizations for your images, fonts, scripts, dynamic HTML streaming. We will look at streaming, suspense boundaries, stuff like that. React server components, they allow you to, at the end of the day, server render your content, data fetching, CSS support, client server rendering, server actions, route handlers, and much more. Also middleware, super important. So at the end of the day, Next.js takes all of the benefits of React, includes a lot of batteries, which are super important for modern web applications. So now you know what Next.js is and why you should probably use it. But since we now know that, I think we should get started. So let's go to the documentation, to installation, and inside of here you will see the installation script. npx create next app. Now this installation command uses npm as a package manager. If you want to use npm, you can copy this command, but in this video I will use pnpm. pnpm is pretty much npm, but it's faster and more efficient. It also plays better with React 19, and that's why I will use it. So I will recommend you to use pnpm, but you can use npm yarn. I don't really care, to be honest with you. So let's again go back to our terminal. Let me close this, and then in my terminal I will cd into my YouTube directory, and inside of here I will do in pnpm create next app at latest. And with the latest command, I will install the latest version of Next.js. Now inside of here, the CLI will ask us a few questions. And the first question is, what is our project name? So in this case, learn Next.js. Then, do we want to use TypeScript? Yeah, sure. Then we want to use ESLint. We want to use Tailwind. We won't use the source directory. The source directory at the end of the day is like a folder where you can store all of your data, but in my opinion, it's not needed. So we won't use it, and it's also pretty much recommended to not use it. At least that's the default option. No. So let's continue. We want to use the app router. This is super important. With the app router, you get all of the benefits of, for example, server components, streaming, stuff like that. You don't get that with the pages router, so please select the app router. Then, do we want to use TurboPack? Yes, we want to use TurboPack. Now, quickly, what's TurboPack? Good question. So that's the next evolution from Webpack, and at the end of the day, TurboPack is an incremental bundler optimized for JavaScript and TypeScript, written in Rust. So this is TurboPack. This is again my recommended choice. It's faster than Webpack. Then we don't want to customize our import alias, and now everything should install. This will take a minute or so let's wait for that. So Next.js has been now installed, and as you see, we also initialized a new Git repository. story. Let's now head over to VS Code and let's open the project. As you see, I already did that, but if you want to do the same, go on top to File and Open Folder. But on the right side, you now see the project directory. Let's quickly go through it. So on the bottom, we have a tsconfig file. The tsconfig file is your TypeScript configuration file. If you use JavaScript, then you won't have this file. But at the end of the day, you see we use ES 2017, strict mode, no emit, blah blah blah. As mentioned, it's in TypeScript configuration file. Then we have a README file. As you all know, this is just your standard README. Then we have in pnpm log file. This is for pnpm. Then we have in package.json, and inside of here we see all of the installed packages. Let's quickly look at them. So we have 3 dependencies, and this is React, React DOM, and Next. So for React, we currently have in version of 19, and for Next 15.2. These are the latest versions, so React 19 and Next.js 15.2. Then we also have development dependencies. These are dependencies which don't show up in your production bundle size, like for example TypeScript, Tailwind CSS, ESLint, and stuff like that. Then we have a next.config file, and the file already says everything, or the name. This is the configuration file for Next.js. Later on, for example, we will use the image component provided by Next.js, and the image component allows you to optimize images. Now, since this has a bit of a cost behind it, I will also cover it later on, you want to whitelist domains, and that's what we will do in this file. But also, if you want to, for example, use better features, you would also configure it inside of here. Then we have an ESLint file. I don't think I have to explain it. We have in git ignore. Please make sure that inside of here you have your .env, because you don't want to commit your env files or secrets. Then we have a public folder, and this public folder is there to store all of your static assets, meaning images, videos, I guess fonts, whatever is static at the end of the day. Then we have a Node modules folder. We don't have to cover that, that's standard in Node.js. And then we have the most important folder, which is the app folder. Inside of here, we first of all have a page.tsx. So this page.tsx is your index page. This is what will be rendered at first, I guess, if this makes sense. So this is localhost 3000 / the index page. Then we have a layout file. The layout file is the wrapper of our children. Let's come to that in a second. Let's first of all finish off the app folder. Inside of here, we also have our globals.css. This is where we store all of our CSS styles. At the end of the day, we use Tailwind. This means we won't do anything inside of here. Nevertheless, if you want to write custom CSS, you would do it inside of here. And then we have our favicon file. Yeah, I think you all know what that is. But now we know how the Next.js project directory looks like. And now the question comes, what are pages and what are layouts? What is this layout.tsx? And what is this page.tsx? Let me show it to you by first of all starting our development server. So let's open our terminal with Command J, or you can go to the top and click on Terminal and New Terminal. So let's open the terminal, and we want to do in pnpm run dev. Our dev server will open on localhost 3000, so I can copy it and open it inside of here. As you now see, we have a bit of a demo markup, if this makes sense, so demo UI. It looks quite nice, but at the end of the day, of course, we will change it. Nevertheless, let's go back. So as mentioned, we have a page.tsx. And as I said, this is the index page. So this right here is what we render right here. So you know what, we can take everything in the return statement and we can just delete it for now. And instead of rendering all of that, let's render an h1 and let's say hello from the index page. If I now save this and go back, you see hello from the index page. So as mentioned, this page.tsx file is your route. And since this is in the root directory of the app folder, this is the index page. But what is the layout.tsx? Well, the layout.tsx is at the end of the day the initial, you could say, layout of your file. This means, as you see, we have an export default function, root layout, and then in the root layout we render our children. What are our children? Well, the children are all of our routes. In this case, one of our children would be the page.tsx. This is in child. This means we first of all render the layout, and then in the layout we render our children, the page.tsx. Let me show it to you with a little graph. So let's imagine the following. This is our screen, right? And as mentioned, we have a layout. A layout, for example, could be a nav bar, and then the children would be rendered inside of here. Now this layout will be persisted on all routes. This means if I would create more routes like hello or dashboard or something like that, then this layout would be persisted on all of these routes, because again, this is in layout and we render the children inside of there. So in this case, if we would render inside of here above our children in H1 and we would say hello from the layout, then this hello from the layout would be rendered on all routes, because again, we first of all render our layout and then we render our children. So now you see hello from the layout and then hello from the index page. So in this graph, we would render first of all the nav bar, and then inside of here, we would have all of our children. And in this case, this is now our index page, right? So index page. But let's imagine that we would now create a dashboard route. So let's say slash dashboard. And in this case, we would still render the original layout and we would of course render our children. So for example, some sort of card and then a few other smaller cards, something like that. So at the end of the day, our layout is persisted on all routes and it does not re-render. So as the documentation says, a layout is UI that is shared between multiple pages. On navigation, layouts preserve state, remain interactive, and they don't re-render. A page.tsx at the end of the day is UI that is rendered on a specific route. So meaning slash dashboard, slash hello, whatever. Okay, so now I think we know what in layout is and what in page.tsx is. If you still don't understand it, that's fine, because once we create more routes, you'll understand the concept of layouts and pages. So now the question is, how do we create our first route? Currently, we only have an index page. But now I want to create a dashboard route. So in the app folder, how about we create a dashboard.tsx, right? No, this is not how it works. So in the Next.js app router, you create routes by creating folders. So in the app folder, we want to create a dashboard folder. This is the route name. And then in the dashboard folder, you want to create a page.tsx. And this is now your route. Please make sure that you always call it page.tsx, because with this, Next.js now knows that this is a route and not just some sort of configuration file or something like that. And inside of here, we can now render something. So this is an export default function. So whenever you create a route, you want to always do an export default function. This is our dashboard route. We can invoke it and open it. Let's create a return statement. And I want to say hello from the dashboard page. So if I now save this and go back, we can go to the URL and I can say slash dashboard. If I click on enter, so you still see hello from the layout, but our children have now updated. They now say hello from the dashboard page. So again, as mentioned, a layout is persisted. It does not re-render. And this dashboard folder is rendered inside of our layout. So as you see, we have our layout, we then render our children, and our dashboard is in child. We can make another example. So in the app folder, I can create an ABC folder. In the ABC folder, we can create a page.tsx. Then we want to do an export default function. This is the ABC route. We can do a return statement. And if I again go back to the URL and say slash ABC, you will see the layout is still persisted, but the children update. So now I hope that you understand how children work, or in other words, how pages work and how layouts work. Layouts create, at the end of the day, as mentioned, the layout. A nav bar, a footer, stuff like that. You don't really want to fetch data inside of there. It's more of an UI layer, if you want to call it like that. A page.tsx is at the end of the day your route. Inside of there, you want to create the UI, but you want to also fetch the data inside of there. So now we know how to create routes. This is great, but how do you link a route? Because currently, if we go to the index page, there's no way to go to the dashboard without manually going to the URL. Well, this is a good question. Let's go again to our index page, and instead of returning an h1, let's return first of all in div. In the div, again in h1, we will say hello from the index page, and now we want to redirect the user. So let's use the a tag. For the href, this will be /dashboard, and then for the text, this will be dashboard. This means if I go back, you now see dashboard, and if I click on dashboard, we will get redirected to /dashboard. Wow, routing is super easy, right? Yeah, routing is easy, but this is not the recommended way. Why is that? Well, if you use the standard HTML A tag, the link tag, if you want to call it like that, you're doing hard refresh, you're doing hard navigation. Let me show it to you again. Let's go back to our index page, and if I click on dashboard, on the top you see that we're doing little hard refresh. This fav icon spins. Again, let's do it. As you see, we did in hard refresh. This is kinda a problem. I want to have client-side navigation. Client-side navigation is faster, and at the end of the day, it creates better UX, user experience. So that's why you want to use a link component in Next.js. So link is a React component that extends the HTML A tag or element to provide prefetching and client-side navigation between routes. This means the link component takes your standard A tag, but it makes it even better. As mentioned, client-side navigation and prefetching. Prefetching just allows you to, at the end of the day, navigate the route even faster because it preloads the route in the background before the user visits this route. So let me show it to you. Let's go back. Instead of using the A tag, we want to get a link component. This is imported from next/link, and let's save it. If I now go back and go to the index page, you see nothing changes from the UI. And if I open my inspector and if I go to my elements, you will also see it still renders as an A tag. Nevertheless, if I now click on dashboard, we will do in client-side navigation, and we also did in the background prefetching. Now in this case there's nothing to prefetch, we don't fetch data, this is in static route. Nevertheless, if we would now in theory fetch something from our database, we would now prefetch it in the background, and then we would pretty much get an instant navigation. So now we know how to redirect a user using client-side navigation. I can also again show it to you with the ABC route, so we can again get our link component. You see we get an error, that's because we want to provide an href, and this will be /abc. Let's also provide in text, and if I go back and click on ABC, you see we just did client-side navigation and we redirected the user to /abc. Nice. Alright, so now we know how to create new routes, we know how to redirect the user, we know what a layout is, we know all of that. But how do we create a dynamic route? Because later on, as you know, we want to create a block system. And this means we will have a route which will be something like /block and then some sort of dynamic value, meaning for example the ID or slug. And if the user clicks on enter, we want to get the value from our params and fetch the corresponding data. How do you achieve something like this in Next.js? Well, it's super simple. So let's start from the fundamentals. We want to create a new route. This means we want to create a new folder. So let's go into the dashboard folder, and inside of here, let's create a new folder. Now, as mentioned, this should be a dynamic route. So if I say slug, will this be dynamic? No, it won't be dynamic. This will now convert to /dashboard/slug. But as mentioned, this should be dynamic. How do you do that? Well, you want to use these array brackets, so I'm not sure how you call them, I just call them array brackets, but this tells Next.js that this is a dynamic route. Now, you don't want to save it like that, you want to also provide a name, and in this case, slug makes a lot of sense. Then in the slug folder, we want to create a page.tsx, and now we have a route. As mentioned, whenever you create a route, you want to do an export default function. Let's call it dashboard route, and let's return an h1, and we will say hello from the dashboard page. If I now save it and go back and do a hard refresh, we have an error. That's because this is /block. Let's first of all go to /dashboard and then some /gibberish. If I click on enter, you see hello from the dashboard page. This is not what I want to render. Let's instead render hello from the slug route. If I save it, you see hello from the slug route. If I change the slug to /dashboard/hello, we won't get any error, and as you see, we now have a new dynamic route. But now you might say, okay, we have a dynamic route, this works. But how do I get the value from the URL? How do I get this dynamic value? Because as mentioned, later on I want to fetch data based on the dynamic value? Well, it's relatively simple. So we can get it through our params. So in earlier versions of Next.js, you could just destructure your params and get them through here. But in recent versions, or with Next.js 15, params are now asynchronous. This means above our export default function, we can create a type. We will call it params. Then this will be equal to in promise, and then for the promise, I want to pass in generic, and we will get in slug, which will be of type string. Now, why do we get in slug? Well, as mentioned, the name of our dynamic route is slug. If this would be ID, then we would of course get an ID. If this would be hello, we would get hello. And then for our export default function, we can now destructure our params, and params will be of type params. So as mentioned, this is now asynchronous. This is a promise, meaning I have to await my params. So let's do in constant, let's destructure it, and this will be equal to await params. And as you now see, I get an error and it says, hey, await expressions are only allowed within async functions. And we also already get a tip right here and it says, hey, did you mean to mark this function as async? Yes, so let's do an export default async function, and then where we destructured, I can get my slug. So this slug is now what we have in our URL, meaning hello. So I can go to my return statement and let's say hello from the slug, colon, and I want to pass my slug. So if I now save it and go back, you see hello from the slug, hello. If I update the slug to some gibberish, then you see hello from the slug, some gibberish. If I say hey, then we see hello from the slug, hey. So now we get our dynamic value from our URL and we render it in our UI. And as you saw, it's super simple to implement, and now we have a dynamic route. But now here's one interesting thing. As you just saw, I marked the function as async, asynchronous. Is this safe? Should you do something like that? Is it recommended, I guess? Well, yes, that's fine. Why can you mark this function as asynchronous? Well, that's because this is a server component. What is that? Good question. So as you see right here, React server components allow you to write UI that can be rendered and optionally cached on the server side. In Next.js, the rendering work is further split by route segments to enable streaming and partial rendering. Now you don't have to know what streaming and partial rendering is right now. We will come to that a bit later on. So now what's the primary benefit of a server component, or of server components in general? Well, server components, as mentioned, run on the server side. And the nice thing is they don't send any JavaScript bundle to the client side. This means that this code is super fast. It's generated on the server side and then rendered. No JavaScript bundle needed. Super cool. But what are more benefits of server components, or in general server rendering? Well, first of all, server components allow you to move data fetching to the server closer to your data source. Also, server components allow you to keep sensitive data and logic on the server side. You don't leak anything to the client side. Also, server components allow you to pretty much cache your data. Super important. And also, they are very performant, because server components give you additional tools to optimize performance from the baseline. Also, the initial page load with server components is way faster. Again, if you use server components, you don't bring any JavaScript bundle size to your website, meaning your website becomes faster. And also, one huge benefit is that server components allow you to implement streaming. Now, we will come to streaming a bit later on. Nevertheless, as you see, server components are super cool, and they are used by default in Next.js. This means this allows you to automatically implement server rendering with no additional configuration. So again, this means our index page is in server component, our dashboard/hey route is in server component, our dashboard route is in server component. No JavaScript bundle is sent in these routes. But what's the con of server components? Well, server components don't give you any interactivity. So let's imagine the following. In this route, I would now want to use some sort of state. So let's say I want to create a counter. Let's do in constant. We want to create a getter and setter. So this will be count and set count. And this will be equal to use state. Use state is imported from React and the initial value is 0. And then inside of our return statement, we want to go underneath the h1 and I want to render a button. And if the user clicks on the button, I want to increment my count. Very simple. If I now save this and go back, you see, we have an error. What's the problem? Well, you are importing a component that needs useState. This React hook only works in a client component. So as mentioned, all routes by default in Next.js are server components. No JavaScript bundle is sent to the client. But in this case, we use useState, and useState needs a JavaScript bundle. So what do? Well, we have to convert our page, our component, to a client component. But in this case, this won't work because, as mentioned, this component is marked as asynchronous. And whenever you have an asynchronous function, you can't mark it as useClient, or you can't mark it as a client component. So we could create a separate component. We could go to our app folder. We could create a components folder. And then inside of here, we could create a counter.tsx. Then we would mark this counter as useClient. And then we can do an export function. This will be counter. Let's invoke it. Let's open it. And we can now use our useState hook. Let's again import it from React. And let's create a return statement with our button. And if the user clicks on the button, we increment our count. I can now use the component, and instead of rendering our button, we will render our counter. Let's also delete the useState hook. We don't need it anymore. Let's import the counter from our components. And if I go back and do a hard refresh, you see no error inside of here. Let's go again to our slug. And as you now see, we have our counter. And if I click on count, this number updates. So this means we now first of all have a server component right here. From our URL, we get our params and we render our slug right here. So hello from the slug. This is a server component. Nevertheless, as mentioned, sometimes you need interactivity in your pages. Sometimes you want to use the useState hook. Sometimes you want to use the useEffect hook, useReducer, whatever. What do you do then? Well, as mentioned, you create a separate component. You mark the component as useClient. This means you now ship JavaScript to this component. And with this, you get interactivity. So now we have this balance of server components. In server components, you can fetch data. You can get data from your URL, stuff like that. This means you have a server rendered UI, but you can also render interactive components in this server component. So now we have this nice blend of very fast routes with interactivity if needed. And if you go to the documentation, you'll also see client components allow you to write interactive UI, which is still pre-rendered on the server. A lot of people confuse it. They think if I render this component as useClient, then I will render this whole component on the client side. No, this component is still pre-rendered on the server side. But instead of now sending no JavaScript bundle, you now send a JavaScript bundle because the useState hook needs it to work at the end of the day. I hope you understand it. So you still render everything on the server side, but now you, at the end of the day, ship a JavaScript bundle. And a useClient component, a client component in general, does not allow you to fetch data. So you fetch data in your server component, and then in your client components, you add interactivity. And as you also see, client components also have access to browser APIs, like for example, local storage, geolocation, and much more. So now let's quickly summarize it. So at the end of the day, every route as a default in Next.js is a server component. A server component allows you to fetch data and stuff like that. And a server component does not ship any JavaScript bundle. But this is also a problem. Sometimes you want to have interactivity, because if you want to have interactivity, you need JavaScript. So this is where client components come into play. Client components ship a JavaScript bundle, but they allow you to add interactivity. So at the end of the day, you use server components to fetch all of your data. And then in your server components, you render client components to add interactivity. The end result is that you get fast websites, interactive websites, while keeping the bundle size relatively small. Okay, so we have now looked at the complete basics of Next.js. You now know how routing works, what a page.tsx is, what a layout is, what server components are, what client components are, stuff like that. As mentioned, the complete basics. But now we want to dive a bit further into Next.js. We want to look at server actions, streaming, authentication, stuff like that, a bit more advanced. And to understand it better, to I guess, teach it to you guys, I think we should start with our project. This means we will now create a blog application. Users can create blog articles, they can view blog articles, and while creating the application, we will dive into more advanced concepts. Again, server actions, streaming, authentication, route handlers, cool stuff like that. So you know what? Let's get started. So first of all, we can delete our dummy code. We don't really need it anymore. Meaning we can delete our ABC folder, because who needs an ABC folder? We can delete our components, we don't need them anymore. And I will delete my dashboard route. So now we only have our page.tsx, our layout, stuff like that. Let's get started first of all with our layout. So currently, if you go back to our code base, you see everything touches the border. You probably only see you probably don't even see the H in the video. That's because we don't have any margin. Not nice. And the thing is, I want to have the same margin for all my pages, for all my children. How do we do that? Well, our best friend, the layout, can help us. So let's go back to our layout. As you all know, the layout is persisted on all routes. This means we can go to our body element. Currently we pass right here our font. So guys, Sans, this is the font provided or the font created by Vercel, the native font. And inside of here we can add a few more class names. So I want to add a maximum width. This will be 7XL. Let's do an MX of auto and let's add some default padding, meaning padding X4 on a mobile screen, SM or bigger, padding X of 6, and on LG or bigger, padding X of 8. If I save it and go back, you now see we have some default padding, and this is already way better. So now we have created like a padding layout, if this makes sense. So our spacing is finished. But currently right here for our navbar, we render an H1 which says hello from the layout. Is this a navbar? Not really. We want to render something beautiful. So we want to create a navbar component. So let's create our navbar component. Let's open the Explorer. Then I want to not go into the app folder. Let's go into our root directory. And inside of here, let's create a components folder. In the components folder, I will create a general folder, and in a general folder, I will create a navbar.tsx. So as you see, this isn't a route, this is a component. I haven't marked this, or I didn't call it page.tsx or anything like that. This is a component, and that's why I just call it navbar.tsx. And inside of here, since this is a component, I can do an export function. This is our navbar. Let's invoke it and let's open it. Let's create a return statement and let's style our navbar. So on the left side, I want to first of all render my logo. So let's first of all get our nav element inside of here. Let's open it. Let's give our nav element a class name, and this will be padding Y of 5, flex items of center to center everything vertically, and justify of between to pretty much put the children to the most outer corner. Then in the nav element, let's render a div element, and then for the div element, I want to give it a class name, and this will be flex items of center, and then gap of 6. So inside of here, I want to now render my logo. So let's get an H1 element, and in the H1, I will say block, then I want to get a span element, and I want to render Marshall. For the span, I want to give it a class name of text blue 500. And now let's save it, let's go back, and where is our navbar? Well, our navbar is a component which is not rendered anywhere. So let's go to our layout, and instead of rendering the H1, I want to render my navbar. This is imported from the components, this is self-closing, and we have block Marshall. Let's style it a bit further. So for the H1, I want to give it a class name of text 3XL and font of semi-bold. If I save it and go back, you see, yeah, this looks already way better. But currently, if I click on block Marshall, nothing happens. That's because this is an H1, this isn't a link. But if the user clicks on the block or on this logo, I want to redirect the user to the index page. Now, as you all know from the basics, how do we redirect the user to a different route? Do we use the standard A tag? No, we use the link component to get client-side navigation and prefetching. So let's wrap our whole H1 in a link component. This is imported from next/link, and let's paste our h1. Our link component now complains. That's because we are missing the href property. So for the link, I can pass an href, and as mentioned, this is our index page. So if I now go back and hover over block Marshall, it now redirects me to my index page. Let's now go back, and then underneath my link, I want to now render my nav elements, my navigation items. Let's get a div element, let's give it a class name, and this will be hidden on a mobile screen on SM or bigger. This will be flex, items off center, and a gap of 6. Then in the div element, again, when a user clicks on a nav item, we want to redirect the user, so we want to use the link component. Let's open it. In the link component, I want to say home, and of course, we want to provide an href. So for the href, this will be our index page, and if you go back, you now see home. Let's also add a bit of styling, so let's give it a class name of text small, font of medium. Then I want to give it a hover, and we want to say text blue 500 and in transition of colors. If I now save this and go back and hover over home, you see we now have this hover state, this hover effect, which looks beautiful. And what I want to now do is copy paste my link component. Let's paste it down below, and instead of now rendering home, we want to render dashboard, and for the href, this will be /dashboard. Let's now save it. Let's go back, and now we have home and dashboard. If I click on dashboard, you see we get in 404 not found, and this is because we haven't defined this route right now, but we will fix it in a second. Let's again go back and let's continue, and the last thing which I want to render is our login and sign up button. This means let's go right here underneath the last div, but still in the nav element, and let's render a new div element. Let's give it of course a class name of flex item center and a gap of, let's say, 4. And then in the div, I want to render a button. How do you render a button in JSX? What a stupid question, right? You just use the button element, you say, I don't know, sign up, save it, and then you have a button. But this button does not look nice. So let's add maybe a class name of text red 500, BG blue 500, rounded LG. Whew, my god, this is so much class names. No, let's skip that. That's too much work. Let's use a component library, and in this video we will use shadcn_UI. So shadcn_UI is a component library, or as shadcn himself would say, a component registry, whatever this means, who cares. Shadcn_UI is a component library which is accessible and styled. Shadcn_UI builds on Radix UI, and Radix UI is a component library which is accessible but not styled. Shadcn_UI takes these components which are not styled and makes them, or styles them and makes them beautiful and very easy to customize and adjust. So yeah, that's why we will use this component library. So we will, for example, use the button component as you see right here, or the card component, we will also use it. So yeah, it has a lot of great components. Let's now get started with installing it. So let's go to installation, Next.js, and we can first of all run the init command to create a new Next.js project, or in other words, to set up shadcn_UI in our Next.js project. So I will copy it, let's go back, let's open the terminal, I will stop it and paste it inside of here. Then for the CLI questions, we can just select all of the default ones. There's nothing I want to update or change. All of the defaults are fine. So as you now see, our project has been initialized, and let's install our first component. So I want to get my button component, let's copy it, and let's paste it inside of here, so the installation command. And now if I open my Explorer, you will see in the components folder, we have an UI folder, and in the UI folder, we have a button.tsx. Now I think you all know what shadcn_UI is. I don't really think I have to explain everything to you guys. But really quickly, if you go to the globals file, to the globals.css, we have all of our CSS variables inside of here, which we can also update if we want to. And if we open the package.json file, you'll also see that we have now installed, for example, Radix UI React Slot, CLSX, Lucid React, which is an icon library, and stuff like that. So this is what is needed for shadcn_UI to work properly. And let's now continue with our button, meaning let's go to our navbar, and instead of rendering this hideous button, we will render a button component imported from our components. Then in the button, I want to say login, and then we can copy paste the button, and for the second button, I will say sign up. If I now go back and do a hard refresh, you see my dev server is not running. So let's open the terminal and let's restart it, meaning pnpm run dev. This will restart the dev server on localhost 3000. I can also do a hard refresh right here, and now we have our two buttons. I mean, they look alright, but let's change the variant a bit. For the sign up button, I can pass the variant property, and this will be secondary, meaning if I save it and go back, we now have our two buttons. But before we continue with authentication, I want to first of all finish off our index page. This means I want to first of all fetch some blog articles, even if they are dummy blog articles. And once the index page is finished, we will continue with the dashboard, we will implement authentication, we will allow the user to create a blog article and stuff like that. But as mentioned, we will come to that a bit later on. So for the index page, what I want to do right now is first of all implement Prisma, or in other words, initialize it. So Prisma is an ORM, a TypeScript ORM, and honestly it's probably my favorite ORM. It's very easy to use, and that's what we will use to interact with our website. We don't want to write raw SQL, we want to use an abstraction over raw SQL. So let's install it, let's open our project. I will stop my terminal. I don't like to open a new terminal tab, but if you want to, you can do it. And then inside of here, let's do an pnpm i-d, uppercase D, Prisma. This means we install Prisma as a development dependency, and it won't show up in your production bundle size. So as you now see, if I open my package.json in our dev dependencies, we now have Prisma. Let's also install Prisma client. So let's do an pnpm i at prisma/client. So these are the two packages which are needed to make Prisma work. And now Prisma has been installed, so we can initialize it. Let's do an pnpm dlx prisma init. This command will initialize Prisma in our project, and as you see, it was successful. Again, please open your git ignore file and double check that you have right here an .env. With this, we just make sure that we don't, at the end of the day, pretty much leak our secrets in our Git repository. And now the first step is to set up our database URL, because if you open your .env file, so we have a new one which was generated by Prisma right here, you'll see that we have a database URL. And currently this is a database URL or a dummy database URL, meaning it does not work. We want to set up Prisma to a real database. Meaning, let's head over to Neon. Neon is a Postgres provider which I use in most of my videos and also privately for janmarshall.com, or soon Marshall Code, if you know, you know. Nevertheless, it's a Postgres provider, it's serverless, it scales to 0, it has branching and many other cool things. If you want to learn more, head over to Neon, or use any other provider. To be honest, I don't care. Supabase is also an option. Nevertheless, let me log in first of all. Once logged in, you will see that I have already a few projects right here in the dashboard, but we want to create a new project. Then for the project name, this will be learn Next.js. For the version, use the latest one. For the database name, let's select the default one. For the cloud service provider, it does not matter. And for the region, select the nearest one to you. And now let's create our project. As you now see, our project has already been created. Let's select Prisma. This is the ORM which we use, and we want to copy our database URL. So I will copy it and paste it inside of here. So now this is finished, and now we can update our Prisma schema. So if you open your Explorer again, you'll see that we have a Prisma folder. In the Prisma folder, we have a schema file. This is where we create all of our tables, or as Prisma calls them, models. Now please open quickly your extensions tab and search for Prisma. Please double check that you have installed the Prisma extension, because the Prisma extension adds syntax highlighting, formatting, auto-completion and much more. So please double check, and if it's installed, we can continue. So currently our Prisma schema, or in other words our database, does not have any models. It does not have any tables. This means we want to create our first table. So as mentioned, Prisma calls them models. So let's create a model. Let's give it the name of block post, let's open it. And each model, at the end of the day, every table has to have a primary key, a unique ID. So let's give it an ID, which will be of type string at ID at default UUID. Then, what does a block have? It has a title. What type is title? It's in string. Then we have content. What type is content? Well, it's in string. Then we have an image URL. What do we want to store for the image URL? Well, probably in string, right? Then we want to have an author ID because we want to know what user created what block article. What type is author ID? Well, in this case, this will be in string. Then we want to also store the author name. This is also of type string. And then we will have the author image, and this will be also of type string. And then there are two more things which I always like to add, and that's the created at timestamp. This is of type datetime at default now. This means whenever we generate a new row in our database, we will automatically create a new timestamp. Let's also create an updated at or add an updated at timestamp. This will be of type datetime and at updated at. Alright, our schema is now finished, and now we want to sync our database with our Prisma schema. Because if you go to Neon and go to your branch or to your tables, you'll see that we don't have any tables. Not quite what we want. So let's go back, let's open our terminal, and let's do an npm dlx prisma db of push. This will now sync our database with our Prisma schema. This will take a few seconds, so let's wait for that. As you now see, our database is in sync with our Prisma schema, and now we can again restart our dev server. So let's do an npm run dev, and let's close the terminal. Let's go back to our page.tsx, and inside of here I want to now fetch my data from our database. But here's the thing, we currently don't have any block articles. And before we learn how to create mutations, I want to first of all learn how to fetch data. This means let's open Prisma Studio, let's open a second terminal tab, a new terminal tab, and let's do an npm dlx prisma studio. This will open Prisma Studio, and this is pretty much the UI for all of your tables. So this means you can manage all of your data inside of here. And we want to create a new blog post, a new blog article, if this makes sense. So let's click on add article. Then for the title, this will be just testing some stuff. For the content, we can just again copy paste it. Then for the image URL, just write something for now, it does not matter. For the author ID, also some gibberish. For the author name Jan. For the author image, some gibberish. For the created at timestamp, this will be generated automatically, and the same is true for updated at. So let's now save our changes, and now we have one blog article. This means I can now close Prisma Studio, I don't need it. Let me stop the dev server for Prisma Studio, I also don't need it anymore. And now we can use Prisma, or in other words, we can now fetch data from our database, because we now have one row, meaning one blog article. So let's first of all pretty much clean up our index page, because it does not look very nice. So let me delete everything in the return statement, and let's create a new div element. Inside of here, let's give it a class name of padding y6 to have some spacing, and let's render an h1, and I want to say latest posts. Let's also give it a class name, and this will be text of 3XL, font of bold, tracking of tight, this means letter spacing, and let's do a margin bottom of 8. If you now save it and go back, you will see right here latest posts. And then underneath the h1, I want to now render my blog articles. This means let's create a new div element, and this div element will be the wrapper div, meaning we want to create a layout, a grid layout. So let's give the div a class name, and this will be grid and grid columns of 1 on a mobile screen. So we will take one column on a mobile screen. Then let's say on MD or bigger, we want to do in grid columns of 2, meaning we will show 2 block cards in one screen or horizontally. And then on LG or bigger, let's do in grid columns of 3, meaning we will show 3 blog articles horizontally. Let's also do in gap, and this will be of 4. And then inside of here, we can now map over our data and then render our individual blog articles, blog cards. So here's the thing, we want to fetch data, right? So how do you do that? How do you fetch data in Next.js 15? As you all know, by default we use server components. Server components run on the server side. Server components allow you to fetch data. This means we will use this page.tsx and we will fetch data right inside of here. So above the export default function, we can create an async function and this will be called getData. And then let's open it. In this getData function, I can do whatever I want to do. I can call some sort of external API, I can call my database using Prisma, or honestly, whatever I want to do. So for now, we can actually hardcode our data. So we can create a constant. This will be called item or items. This will be equal to an array, and in the array, we will have an object. In the object, we will have a title of some gibberish, and let's also create a content of some gibberish. So now we have an array items which is hard-coded. Currently we don't fetch any data, but we will come to that in a second. So now with this array, we can just return our data. So return items. And now we have our async function. In the async function, we have data and we return the data. So let's call the function in our export default function. So above the return statement in our, you could say UI function, we can do a constant data and this will be equal to await get data. Let's invoke it, and again, as you know, we get one error. The error is that await expressions are only allowed within async functions. This means we want to update the function and this should be an export default async function. Again, this is a server component. This is safe to do so. If this would be a client component, you would want to never add the async modifier. But in this case, this is a server component. Everything runs on the server side. Nothing is leaked, nothing is unsecure, everything is fine. You can do that, and that's the recommended way, to be honest. Or the only way, yeah. So now we have our data, and as you see, our data is an array of type title and content. This means in my div, inside of here, I can now get my data, we can map over it, let's get an item, and let's return it. Then inside of here, let's just return an h1, and I want to get my item.title. Now, as you see, we currently get an error. You should know why we get the error. This is a React error. We want to pass in key iterator. And for the key, this will be our item.title. Let's now save it. Let's go back, and we should see in title. Let's see AS blah blah blah, some gibberish. Okay, great. But now here's the thing. We did not really fetch any data, right? This is an async function, but this is hard-coded data. I want to have real data. So let's update this constant items, let's delete it, and instead I want to fetch data using Prisma. So let's do a constant data, and this will be equal to await Prisma. Now, as you see, currently it gives us an option of importing Prisma from Prisma client. You don't want to do that. Let's head over to Google and type with me Next.js Prisma best practices. Let's click on enter, and right here you already have the first link or the first result. Please click on this result, and right here you will see in section best practices for using Prisma client in development. And let's read through it. So it says, when developing a Next.js application, one common issue is accidentally creating multiple instances of Prisma client. This often occurs due to Next.js's hot module reloading feature in development. So whenever we click on Command S to save our file, you see that our site refreshes, meaning hot module reloading. Everything updates and we see the new result in our browser. But whenever you do that, you will also automatically create a new instance of Prisma. And after some sort of time, after enough instances have been created, your database will be exhausted. Meaning in development, you want to create an global Prisma client, a single Prisma client, which is used always in development. And in production, you can use this normal Prisma imported from Prisma client. So let's open our Explorer. Then in our Explorer, let's go in the app folder. And in the app folder, let's create a new folder, which will be the utils folder. In the utils folder, let's create a db.ts. And then I can copy this code and paste it inside of here. So let's quickly look at the code. First of all, we import Prisma client from Prisma/client. Inside of here, we do an if check and we say, hey, if we are not in production, meaning if we are in development, then let's bind Prisma to a globalton, meaning in development we will use one Prisma instance. But if we are in production, then let's just use Prisma client, meaning constant Prisma equals to new Prisma client. So now we have covered that, meaning I can now use Prisma. Let's again do in constant data equals to await Prisma. Prisma is imported from the utils folder. Dot, we want to get our block post and we want to fetch it, meaning let's do in find many. I want to find many block articles. Let's invoke it, let's destructure it, and let's create a select statement. I don't want to select everything. I don't need the updated ad, the created ad, or maybe I need the created ad, but let's select it. So first of all, let's get our title. Let's set it to true. I want to get my content. Let's set it to true. Then I want to get my image URL. Let's set it to true. Then what else do we need? How about the author image? Let's set it to true. And let's get the author name. Let's also set it to true. Then what else do we have? We have the author ID, created ad, and ID. I don't need the author ID, but let's get the individual ID. Let's select it, meaning ID true. And you know what? Let's also get the created ad timestamp. So now we have our Prisma query. We find many block articles and we also select what data we need, meaning title, content, image URL, author image, author name, ID, and created ad timestamp. So now we have our data. We fetched our data from our database using Prisma, and now we can return our data. So let's return our data. And as you see, we already await our data in our export default function, meaning everything should work. So let's save it, let's go back and let's do a hard refresh. And as you see, just testing some stuff. This is the title which we just created, which means that we now successfully fetch data from our database and that we rendered inside of our web page. Again, this is in server component. This means everything runs on the server side. This also means that in theory, you could do some, not risky stuff, but I think you understand what I mean. Right here, you don't leak anything. You can fetch sensitive data. You can work with sensitive data inside of here. You wouldn't do, or you should never do something like that in a client component because again, you ship JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. But in a server component, you can work with a lot of data, with sensitive data. And since this is a server component, meaning everything runs on the server side, you can also pretty much use dependencies, which are very heavy in size because you don't send the dependency to the client side. So yeah, that's a huge benefit of server components. And as you see, fetching data is super easy. You just create an async function and then you await this function in your export default function. So we're now finished with fetching data. You now know how it works and how easy it is. So what do we do now? Do we create the UI for our blog article? I mean, I guess we could do that, but let's maybe first of all continue with the dashboard and let's allow the user to create a full blog article. And once that's done, we can render the full card inside of here because currently we don't have an image URL, author ID, stuff like that. So it does not really work right now. So let's first of all allow the user to create a blog article, and after that we will create a beautiful blog card inside of here. So if I currently click on dashboard, we redirect the user to /dashboard, but we get in 404 not found. This means we don't have a route because the page could not be found. So let's change that. Let's open our Explorer, let's go to the app folder, and we want to create a new route. As you all know, we create a new route by creating a new folder. What's the name? Well, the name is dashboard. This is the route. And in the dashboard folder, we want to create an hello.tsx file. No, I'm joking. We want to create a page.tsx. So now we have our dashboard route. And as you all know, whenever you create a new route, you want to do an export default function. Let's call it dashboard route. I can invoke it and open it. Then let me also return something, and I will return an h1 and I will say hello from the dashboard. If I now save it and go back and do a hard refresh, you see hello from the dashboard. Nice. But here's one big problem. I'm currently not authenticated because we haven't even implemented authentication, but I'm still able to view this route. This shouldn't happen. Only authenticated users should be able to view the dashboard, and at the same time, only authenticated users should be able to create a new blog article. This means we want to now implement authentication, and once we have authentication, we can implement something very fancy, which is middleware. But you know what? Let's first of all implement authentication. So for authentication, we will use kind, the sponsor of this video and my favorite auth solution, as you see by the t-shirt. This is a kind t-shirt. Nevertheless, what is kind? Kind is an auth provider which allows you to implement both authentication and authorization, auth N, auth Z, but it has a lot of other cool features, like for example feature flags. And one thing which I'm super hyped about is billing. Billing will come out very soon, and this will allow you to implement billing in your application with complete ease. You don't have to set up Stripe anymore. Everything will be done automatically. Right now it's in private beta, but once it comes out, expect a cool video. So now you know what kind is. In summary, a great auth service, my favorite auth service. But now we want to implement kind. So let's do it. Let's first of all sign in. Once signed in, you'll see that I will get redirected to in business. In business is in project, but as you all know, we want to create a new business. So let's head over to the bottom left corner, click on your icon, and then let's switch our business. Now you see all of my businesses right here, and I want to add a new business. We want to add a business name. This will be learn Next.js 15. For the number of employees, 1 to 10 is fine, and for the region, I will select the US. Let's now save this. As you now see, my business has been created successfully, and now I can click on it to open it. Now we have a little onboarding guide, so I want to implement kind with my existing code base, so let's select that. Then I want to use kind with my Next.js code base. Let's click on next, and I want to allow my users to sign in with email, with Google, and let's select GitHub. Let's click on next. And now we are almost finished. The last step is to use kind or to connect kind to our code base. So let's click on connect, and now we have a quick start guide right here. The first step is to install the SDK, so I can copy it, open my terminal, let me stop it, and let's do npm I kind OSS kind of Next.js. Then the next step is to update our environment variables. Let me copy them. I will open my env file, and then I can paste them inside of here. This stores our client ID, client secret, issue URL, site URL, and then also the logout redirect and login redirect URL. Meaning when the user logs in, we will redirect the user to /dashboard. This is fine. Let's leave it like that. Let's now continue. So we have now installed the SDK, we have updated our env file or env variables, and now we want to add an API endpoint. So at the end of the day, our project has to talk to kind. How do you do that? You do that with an API, a public API. So let's first of all create the API, and then I will explain how an API works in Next.js. So right here we have our file structure. Let's copy this whole thing from the API folder. So API of kind of route.js. Let's copy it. Let's open the Explorer. Then let's go to the app folder. Let's click on create new file, and then you can paste this whole route structure. This will automatically generate a new folder, as you see right here, within route.js. This shouldn't be in route.js, but rather in TS, since we have a TypeScript project. And now we can copy this code and paste it inside of here. So what did we just do right here? Well, we just created an API route. So at the end of the day, you have your kind application, right? Your kind server. And then you have your own server, your Next.js server. These two servers have to talk to each other. You do that by using an API route and public API endpoint. And to create a public API endpoint in Next.js, you use route handlers. Route handlers are API routes. The route handler name is just a marketing term created by Next.js. But let's look at the documentation. So route handlers allow you to create custom request handlers for a given route using web request and response APIs. So at the end of the day, a route handler is an API route. It works like an API route. You can expect a get request or a post request or a put request and delete request. In this case, we expect a get request. As you see, we have the verb get. And yeah, this means we don't allow a user to create a post request to this route handler. And how do you create a route handler? Well, you do it by first of all opening the app folder, then you create an API folder, and then in your folder structure, you want to create a route.ts. If you call the file hello.ts, then this won't convert to an API route. If you want to have an API route, you have to name your file specifically route.ts. The same logic applies to our page.tsx, right? If you call it hello.tsx, this won't be a route. If you don't call the API route route.ts, then this won't be a route handler, an API route. At the end of the day, you can also use route handlers to create mutations, meaning post requests or put requests or delete requests, whatever you want to. But in this video, we will use something else to create mutations. For now, we only need a route handler to talk to kind. So now this is finished. Let's head over again to the documentation. We are finished with API endpoints, and there's one more thing which we have to implement, and that's the kind of provider. So please head over to the kind documentation, and there you will see the section setup kind of provider. So we want to wrap our app in the kind of provider. This will give us access to the kind of data in our application, and it will ensure that all of the tokens are refreshed when needed. So let's go back, let's open the Explorer, then let's open our components folder, general folder, and then inside of here, let's create an auth provider.tsx file. Let's copy the code and let's paste it inside of here. As you see, this component is marked as use client, and that's because the auth provider or the kind provider needs a JavaScript bundle. It needs the client side. Currently, our children also get an error, so let's give our children a type of React Node. And since this is now finished, let's head over to the documentation, and the next step is to wrap our application in the auth provider component. So let's go to the layout. I will copy the HTML, and I want to wrap the HTML in my auth provider. Let's import it from the components, and let's again paste the HTML. So now this is finished, and that's great. But now let's talk quickly about a misconception that a lot of people have. So our auth provider is a client component. Our layout is a server component, and all of the children which we render in the auth provider, meaning the navbar and our children itself, they are also server components. A lot of people think that if you wrap them in a client component, then this means that all of your children are now client components. This is not true. If you have a layout and your layout is wrapped by a client component, the children are still the native form, meaning if your page.tsx is in server component, it will stay in server component. If your navbar is in server component, it will stay in server component. It does not matter that they are wrapped in a client component. Sure, the auth provider is a client component, but your navbar and all of your children stay server components. This is great, but this is only true in the layout. Let's imagine the following. If we open the page.tsx, or let's open our dashboard route, so dashboard page.tsx, you see this is a server component. If I mark this as use client, then this is now a client component. Okay, very basic. But now let's imagine the following. I create a child component. So in my components in the general folder, I create a test.tsx file. And this component is there to fetch some data. So we could say, hey, export async function, and I want to fetch some data. And now I take this component and I render it in the dashboard. Does this component stay in server component, or does it automatically become a client component? Well, in this case, if I would render this, so let's create it quickly. So test, I can invoke it, open it, I can return something, I don't know, h1, hello, and then I can take the test component and I can render it inside of here. So let's get test from our components, and this is self-closing. So test is a server component, it's asynchronous. Our dashboard route is a client component. Is test now in server component or in client component? Well, in this case, test is now in client component. So whenever you work with layouts, so let's again open our layout, you will leave the components with their initial state. Meaning, if your children are server components, they will stay server components. But if you have a route, like for example our dashboard, which is marked as a client component, and then you render a child component like test, then this test component will automatically become a client component because you render a component in use client. This means it takes the directive from the top route, meaning the dashboard. In a layout, everything stays the same. Again, I will reiterate it. In a layout, it does not matter if you wrap your stuff in a client component. This still is in server component. In a page.tsx, this isn't true. in the page.tsx, your component now becomes a client component. This means if I open my test component, I'm not able to fetch data inside of here anymore. If I would fetch data inside of here, we would throw an error. So this means a best practice is always to leave your standard route as a server component, fetch your data inside of here, and then create a client component and pass all of your data inside of there as props. Meaning this should be a server component, test should be a client component, and then I would pass my data as a property right here, as you see. So we can now again delete our test component. This was just for demo purposes, we don't need it. And now we can continue. So now we have set up kind in our project, meaning we have our auth provider, stuff like that. And now we want to allow the user to sign in, or in other words, sign up. So this means let's open our navbar again. And for our dashboard, let me also delete this import. We don't need it anymore. And if I go to my navbar again, we have our two links right here, or we have our two buttons for login and sign up. But if I click on these buttons, nothing happens. These are only buttons. This means we want to now tell our application that we want to redirect the user to kind. And there's a very handy trick. So if you go again to the quick start guide, you will see that we have a register link and login link component. And this is what we can use to start the auth flow. So let's copy the import statement for the register and login link. I will paste it on top. So we import register link and login link from kind OSS, kind of Next.js / components. And now instead of rendering a button for login, we can get our login link. And instead of rendering a button for sign up, we can render our register link. But now we can't pass a variant. So let me delete the variant. Let's save it. Let's go back. And now we have two buttons, or in other words, two links. So this does not look nice. And the problem is login link and register link, or I'm not even sure if it's a problem, it's a good thing, but the login link and register link, both of these are headless components, meaning you have to style them yourself. But we want to use the shared CN styles, so we can provide a class name, and this will be equal to button variants. Button variants is imported from our button component. We can invoke it, and let's do the same for the register link, meaning button variants. If I now save it and go back, we have two nice buttons. Let's change the variant for sign up. So I can destructure it, we can get a variant, and this will be secondary. Let's save it, let's go back, and now we have a login and sign up button. Let's now sign up, meaning if I click on a button, we will get redirected to the kind sign up route. Right here, I can continue with Google, GitHub, or with email. Let's continue with Google. And as you now see, I got redirected back to the dashboard. That's again because if you open your env file, we have a kind post login redirect URL, and we redirect the user after login to our dashboard route. So I can again close this, but now we have one problem. So we currently have a valid user session, but on top we still render the login and sign up button. That's not what I want to do. If the user has a valid session, I want to render a logout button, and I want to also render the name of the user. So we want to get the session right here in our navbar. So our navbar is a server component, right? This means we can fetch data from the server inside of here. So to get data from kind, we have to use the getKindServerSession hook. So let's do a constant, let's destructure it, and this will be equal to getKindServerSession. This is imported from kind OSS, kind of Next.js / server. Let's invoke it, and then where I destructure it, I can get the getUser function. The getUser function is in promise, meaning I have to await the function. So let's do a constant user equals to await getUser. Let's invoke it, and now we get an error. It again says, hey, await expressions are only allowed within async functions. This means we want to mark the function as export async function. Again, this is safe to do so because this is a server component. Everything runs on the server side. If I would mark it as use client, you'll see we will get an error and it says, hey, this method must be invoked in a Node.js environment, meaning on the server side. So let's delete the use client. This is in server component, and now we get our user. But at the end of the day, it could be that the user is not authenticated, meaning we could either have a valid session or not valid session if the user is not authenticated. So let's do in ternary. Let me copy this div and let's do the following. Let's say, hey, if we have a user, let's render a question mark in ternary, and let's render a div element. Inside of here, I want to render the user name. So let's get the user user.givenName. The given name is the first name. And if this is not true, let's render a colon, and I want to render again my old div with our login link and register link. This means if we have a user, we render the username. If not, we render the login and register link. If I save it and go back, you now see Jan. Let's also render a logout link, meaning underneath the p tag, I will get the logout link component, again imported from kind. Let me open it, and inside of here I will say logout. Again, this is a headless component, so let me provide a class name of button variants. I will invoke it, and I will also provide a variant which will be secondary. Let's also give our div quickly in flex class name or flex layout, so a class name of flex, items of center, and gap of 4. If you now save it and go back, you now see my name and a logout button. If you go back to your kind dashboard, you'll see that we now have one user, so I will go to the home page and you see one total user. And who is this one user? Well, of course, it's me. Who else could it be? But now let's again continue. So now we are finished with our navbar. We render all of our links, and also on the right side, the user is allowed to log in, sign up, or in other words, sign out if the user has a valid session. This is great, this is nice. Let's also quickly test it out. I will click on log out and we should get redirected to the index page. Yes, this was successful, and now let's again log in. Now as you see, we have right here a white background color. I don't like it, so let's quickly head over to the kind dashboard. Let's click on design and then let's scroll a bit to the bottom. As you see, you can upload your logo, your fav icon, but I want to change my theme and I want to make the theme user preference, meaning both light mode and dark mode. Let's now save our preference, and if I do a hard refresh, we now have dark mode. Nice. Let's now continue again with Google with our account, and as you now see, I'm again authenticated and I got redirected back to the dashboard route. Now here's one interesting thing. Right here we fetched our kind session, or we fetched our user session using kind in our navbar component using the server side. This has a few implications on caching, but we will cover that later on at the end once we deploy our application, because caching is super important in Next.js. But again, we will cover that at the end, since that's a bit of a more complex topic or an advanced topic. Let's now again close our navbar and let's continue with our dashboard. Here's the thing, our dashboard is in private route. This means only authenticated users should be able to view the dashboard route. But if I copy the URL and open it in a new incognito tab, you see I'm still able to view the dashboard route. But this shouldn't happen. I want to only allow authenticated users to view this route. How can we fix it? Well, there's one easy fix, and that's if you open your dashboard, you can fetch your user session inside of here. So we can do the following. We can do a constant, we can do structured, and this will be equal to get kind server session. Let's invoke it, and then where I destructured, we can get our get user function. Again, get user is a promise. So let's do a constant user equals to await get user. Now you should all know why we get an error. That's because we have to mark our function as asynchronous. Again, this is a server component. This is safe to do so. And now we have our user session, or in other words, we fetch our user session, right? So let's do an if check, let's do an if statement, and we will say, hey, if we don't have a user, we do that with the exclamation mark, then let's redirect the user to authenticate to the authentication page. But now the question is, how do you redirect a user in Next.js? Good question. Let's head over to the documentation, our best friend. So right here you see there are a few ways you can handle redirects in Next.js. So the most common one is the redirect API itself. But here's the thing, redirect only works in server components, server actions, and route handlers, meaning only on the server side. Now in this case, this is on the server side, right? Meaning we can use the redirect API. So we can do in return redirect, so let's say return redirect. This is imported from next/navigation, and then we can invoke it, and for the argument we want to pass the URL. We want to redirect the user to /API/auth user.kind/register. So this means if we don't have invalid user session, we will redirect the user to the route handler. So this is our route handler, and then kind will internally redirect the user to the hosted authentication page. So let's test it out. Let me copy the URL, let me open it in a new incognito tab, and now we should redirect the user. Let's see. And yes, as you see, this is our hosted authentication page. So we can again close this, and as you now see, this works great. And here's also one thing which I'll mention. So redirect can be called in client components during the rendering process, but it can't be called in event handlers. So if you want to call, or if you want to redirect a user in an event handler, you want to use an useRouter hook. So the useRouter hook is the native hook for the client side. You initialize it by doing a constant router equals to useRouter, and then you can do whatever you want to do. So meaning if you want to use an on-click handler, an event handler, you would use the router and you would say, hey, I want to push the user to the route dashboard. So since we use the server side right here, we can just use the redirect hook, or in other words, since we don't use an event handler, we can use the redirect hook. But if you want to use an event handler like an on-click handler or an on-submit handler, then you would use the router package or the router API, or in other words, the router hook, my God, or the useRouter hook. So now we can again close this. So now we check that the user has an invalid session. All of this works, that's great. Nevertheless, writing this code is kinda annoying, and later on we will have the route dashboard create, and we will also have to protect this route. Is there any way where we can, at the end of the day, protect all of our routes without writing this code every time? Well, there is actually a feature which is called Middleware in Next.js. What is middleware? So middleware allows you to run your code before a request is completed. Then based on the incoming request, you can modify the response by rewriting, redirecting, or modifying the request or response handlers, or responding directly. So at the end of the day, let's look at this graph. So this is your browser, right? And your browser, your user, does a request to your server. So at the end of the day, in GET request and POST request, whatever. And at the end of the day, when you deploy your application to Vercel, you use serverless functions. This means you do a request, your serverless function spins up and then serves your request. Maybe your function, your server, also talks to your database, but at the end of the day, you do a request and your server responds with the payload. This is how our application right now works. But then there's this feature, which is middleware. And right here, I have created an example. We again have our browser. Our browser sends a request to our server. But before the server even gets the request, middleware intercepts the request. It then does something with the request. Maybe middleware checks if the user is authenticated. If not, middleware redirects the user, or maybe middleware does something with your headers. I'm not sure. Middleware intercepts your request and then does something with the request. If everything is valid, then middleware will pretty much push your request to your server, and then your server will do something with your request, fetch some data, generate some data, I don't know, and then again send the payload to your browser. So at the end of the day, middleware is like a very light and fast layer in front of your server. Your server is this big thing and your middleware is the small layer which is very quick. And right here Next.js also mentions the use cases like, for example, authentication and authorization as mentioned before, server-side redirects, path rewriting, bot detection, logging, analytics, stuff like that. But in most cases I use it for authorization to check if the user has invalid session. And again, summarized, middleware is a very lightweight layer in front of your server. It's deployed globally and it runs super fast. This means we can right here intercept our request and we can check if the user is authenticated. If not, we will just redirect the user, so I can get an arrow for example, and we will redirect the user to, for example, kind. Kind will then authenticate our user and then kind will redirect the user to our server. So this is how everything will work. Let's now implement middleware. So let's again go back to our code. Let's open the Explorer. And now where do you create your middleware file? Well, you create it in your root directory. Please don't go into your app folder. This won't work. You want to create it in the root directory. Let's create a new file, and this will be the middleware.ts file. So inside of here, we can now create our middleware code. So let's go to the Next.js or to the kind documentation. Then you can search for setup middleware, and right here you will see middleware is used to protect routes in your Next.js application. It's a requirement for seamless authentication experience. So kind uses an with-auth helper, and this will protect our routes covered by the matcher. If the user is not authenticated, then the user will be redirected to log in. And once logged in, we will redirect the user, or kind will redirect the user back to the protected page, and they will have access to this route. So now let's set it up. So right here they have a middleware configuration example. Let's skip that. We want to use this example, opting routes out of middleware protection. Let's copy the code example and let's paste it inside of here. Right here we currently get an error for request. We don't need it, so let's just delete our request. And now what do we do inside of here? So first of all, we have an export constant config with a matcher. What is this matcher? So if you again go to the documentation, it says right here, we require this middleware to run on all routes besides Next.js internals and static files. This means we have this matcher and we tell the middleware, hey, you should run on all routes, but please don't run on these static routes. This is not needed. And then we also have our with-auth function, and with the with-auth function we will now check if the user has a valid session. But now we have one problem. This with-auth function will run on all routes. It won't run on our static assets, so on our CSS and stuff like that, but it will run on the index page, it will intercept our dashboard page, it will intercept all routes. But as you know, our index page is in public route. Everyone is able to view it. Only our dashboard route is private. So here's what we can do. We can use a property which is called public paths. So let's get public paths. Public paths is an array, so I can just copy it right here. Let's paste it. And as mentioned, this is an array. And every path which I now add inside of here will be public. As mentioned, our index page should be public, so let's add an empty slash. So let's again open our dashboard route right here, and let's delete this authorization check. We don't need it. Let's also delete the import statements. Let's go back and let's do a hard refresh. So now we only have our middleware for our authorization check. Let's copy the URL and let me open it in a new incognito tab. So now I should get automatically redirected to authenticate, and that's what happened. So now the middleware intercepted my request, kind checked if the user has a valid session. This user does not have a valid session, meaning kind took the request and redirected the user to authenticate. Nice. Let's now again close this and let's open our index page. As mentioned, our index page is in public endpoint. So if I copy it and open it in a new incognito tab, the user should still be able to view the route, and that's what we have right here. Great. So middleware now works exactly as expected. Middleware intercepts our request, kind checks if the user has a valid session. If not, kind redirects the user. But if the user has a valid session, well then great, good job. And of course, if you later on add more routes, like for example an about route or an hello route or stuff like that, then you would add it right here. So you would add a comma and then say, I don't know, slash about, and then maybe another route like slash hello. You would add all of your public routes inside of here. But all of the routes which are not added inside of here will be automatically protected by our middleware. So let's again delete the hello and about. Since we don't have these routes, we only have an index page. And now we're finished with authentication and authorization. Okay, so now I want to continue with our dashboard. And what I want to do explicitly is allow the user to create a new blog article. So let's go back to VS Code. Let's open our Explorer. Let's go to the app folder, to the dashboard folder, or to the route if you want to call it like that. And in the dashboard route, we want to create another child route, meaning we want to have an URL of /dashboard/create. How do you create a route in a route, if this makes sense? Well, you create a child folder, meaning in the dashboard folder, we create another folder. This will be the create folder, and then let's create a page.tsx. Since this is a route, we want to do an export default function. So let's do an export default function. We will name it create block route, I can invoke it and open it. Let's do in return div h1 hello world. Let's save it, let's go back, and as you see, you don't see anything. So let's go to our URL and let's say dashboard/create. If I click on enter, you now see hello world. So in my index page for the dashboard or in my dashboard route, I want to now render a button on the right side which redirects the user to this create route. So let's go back to our dashboard index page, and inside of here, let's update our return statement. Let's delete this div and let's start off fresh. Let's create a div, and then in this div, let's render another div. This will be the wrapper div, meaning inside of this div, we will render our heading and we will render our button on the right side. So for the div, let's create an layout. So let's give it a class name of flex, items of center, justify of between to align the children to the most outer corner, and margin bottom of 4. Then in the div, I want to render an h2, and then for the h2, I want to say your blog articles. Then let's of course give it also a little class name, and I want to say text of XL and font of medium, so a bigger font weight. If I save it and go back, you now see your blog articles, and as mentioned on the right side, I want to have a button. So underneath the h2, we can get our link component, since when the user clicks on the button, we want to redirect the user. And again, the link component provides client-side navigation and prefetching. So let's import the component from next/link. Let's open it. And inside of here, I want to say create post. As you now see, our link component currently complains, and that's because we are missing one property, which is the href. So let's provide an href, and this will be /dashboard/create. If we save it and go back, you now see this link, and if you hover over it, it redirects to the correct URL. Nevertheless, it looks quite ugly. So let's give our link right here a class name, and I want to style the link like in shared CN button. How do you style a headless component like in shared CN button? Well, you use the button variants function. Let's import it from the components, let's invoke it, let's save it, let's go back. And now you have right here, create post. Nice. So let's now again click on create post, and now I got redirected to our hello world. So now we can update our creation route. Do I want to render hello world? No, I want to render in cart, and in the cart I want to render my form with a label, input, text area, and a submit button. So let's go back and let's go to our create route, and inside of here I want to first of all render a cart. Now we could create our own cart, but then we will have to style everything, and that's useless and annoying work. So let's go to our best friend ui.shadcn.com and let's search for the cart component. This is what I want to use. So let me copy the installation command, let's open the terminal, let's paste it inside of here. Then what else do I want to get? I want to get the label component. This is what will be rendered above our input and text area. So I can copy the installation command, let's also paste it in our terminal. Then I want to get my input. This is the input which we want to use, it's accessible and it looks beautiful. So let me copy the installation command and I will also paste it inside of here. And then there's one more component which is needed, and this is the text area. So I can copy the installation command and then I can paste it in my terminal. So to be honest with you, I think that's all. So let me restart my dev server with pnpm1 dev. I can do a hard refresh, and now let's create our cart. Let me delete everything in the return statement, and I want to start with a fresh div. In the div, I want to get my cart component imported from the components. In the cart, I want to get a cart header from my components. In the cart header, I want to get a cart title, and I want to say create post. Then underneath the cart title, I want to get a cart description. And inside of here, I want to say create a new post to share with the world. Alright, if I save it and go back, you now see this cart, which looks quite cool. Let's now continue. Underneath my cart header, I want to get cart content, imported from the components, and then in the cart content, I want to render my form element. Let's delete the action, we don't need it, and then in the form, let's render another div element. So in this div, I want to now render a label and an input. So let's first of all get the label from our components, and inside of here, I want to say title. This means if I now go back, you see this label. Let's of course also render the input, so underneath the label, I will get an input from our components. If I now save it and go back, you now see our label and then the input. But now I have one problem. As you see right here, there's no spacing. So let's go to our div, to the wrapper div, and let's give it a class name of flex, flex of column, and gap of 2. As you now see, this already looks way better. And also, as you saw a minute ago, I deleted the action from the form. This is fine, we will add it later on again once we submit our form. So now we have our first label and input combo. Let's now copy paste the div. Let's update the label. This won't be for our title, but now for our content. And instead of rendering an input, I want to get my text area component from my components. Then let's again copy paste our div, and this will be for our image. So for the label, I will say image URL, and instead of rendering in text area, I want to get an input. If I now save it and again go back, we now have a title, content, and image URL. But currently there's no spacing between our items, which looks quite ugly. So let's fix that. Let's go to our form and let's give our form a class name of flex, flex of column, and gap of 4. If I save it and go back, this already looks way better. Let's now also render in button, meaning underneath our div but still in the form. Let's get our button component from the components, and I will render create post. If I save it and again go back, this now looks very beautiful. Currently the card takes the whole width, and maybe that's a bit too big. So let's give our card a maximum width. So I can give it a class name, and we could say max width of LG and MX of auto. If I again go back, yeah, you know what, I think this is a bit better. So now, before we create our mutation, meaning before we allow the user to submit the form, let's first of all do a bit of necessary work, I guess, meaning let's add client-side validation. Let's go back to our code base. Let's go to our first input. This is for the title. Let's give it first of all a required property. Let's give it a type of text, and I want to provide a placeholder. For the placeholder, this will be title. Let's do the same for the text area, meaning required. Then we want to add a placeholder, and I will just say content. And then for the input, for the image URL, let's also give it a required property. Let's give it a type. This will be URL. And I want to provide a placeholder of image URL. Let's again save it. Let's go back. Okay, this already looks like a form. So now I want to allow the user to submit my form. How do I do that? Using the server side. Meaning I don't want to submit the form on the client side. This is not good, this is not safe, you don't want to do that. You want to always create a connection to your database from the server side. So how do I mutate at the end of the day my database with my new values? How do I create a new post in my database from the server side in Next.js easily? Good question. So as I mentioned relatively at the start, you can create mutations in Next.js using two methods. Either you create a route handler. This is what we did for kind. So for kind, we created a route handler. This is a get request. Nevertheless, this is a route handler. We could create a route handler which accepts a post request, and using that, we could at the end of the day mutate our database. This is one method, it's fine. But in this case, we don't really need an API route. Maybe there's another way to create a mutation. Maybe we can create something like a function while still running the code on the server side. Maybe there's something like a server action function. And yes, there is. There's something which is called server actions. So server actions are asynchronous functions which are executed on the server side. This means you create your standard function, but instead of running the function on the client side, you run it on the server side. Boom! Very cool. So they can be called in server and client components to handle form submissions and data mutations in Next.js. Okay, this is super cool. So you can create a function, and this function runs on the server side and does your mutation. Cool. Let's test it out. And now there are two ways to, at the end of the day, create server actions. You can either create server actions in file. This means we can create an inline server action, or you can create server actions in an external file. I will show you both examples, but we will later on use the external method. So let's create our internal server action. Let's go above the return statement and let's do an async function. I will call it handle submission, and then we can invoke it and open it. But now you might say, hey Jan, this is just an async function. Does this not run on the client side? And yeah, you're right. This function right now would run on the client side. But that's not what we want. Prisma only works on the server side. So how do we convert this normal function to a server action? Well, you use a keyword in directive, which is use server. So use server now converts this normal function to a server action. This function will now run on the server side. So even if I mark this file as use client, meaning this file is now in client component, this function will still run on the server side. This is completely safe to do so. You can connect to your database, everything will be fine. So let's do it. Let's go underneath our use server and let's do a constant data equals to await Prisma. We can import Prisma from our utils file or folder, then dot, and we want to get our blog post and I want to create a new one. So dot create, and then we can invoke it and structure it. Then inside of here, we want to pass our data property, and for our data, we want to now pass the author ID, author image, author name, and stuff like that. Now we could do everything inside of here as mentioned. We could now get our form data and then pass it. But in my opinion, it's not very clean code to, at the end of the day, create your mutation layer in code in your UI layer. So let's delete the server action from here and let's rather create an external file where we will store all of our server actions. Because again, as mentioned, you can create server actions in file, in your code, or you can create a separate file. And that's what I like to do. So let's open our Explorer. Let's go to the app folder and let's create an actions.ts file. So in this file, I will store all of my server actions. Now, how do we get started inside of here? Well, let's again go back and let's copy our function. Let's paste it inside of here and let's do an export async function because we want to now at the end of the day call it inside of here. Then we can delete our server action from our route itself. We now only have our actions, and let me quickly also delete the mutation. So we can just do in console.log inside of here and we will say hello. So now we have a server action called handle submission. As you see, use server, which means that this is now in server action, and then we do in console log, and this should console log in our terminal because this is again on the server side. So let's go back to our create route. Let me delete Prisma. This is an unused import. And now for our form, we can provide an action. And for the action, we want to call at the end of the day our server action with the name handle submission. So let's paste it inside of here. Let's import it from our actions. And now let's test it out. Let's save it. Let's go back and we have an error. The hell is that? So it is not allowed to define inline use server annotated server actions in client components. What's the problem right here? Well, if you go to the documentation, you'll see to call a server action in a client component, create a new file and add the use server directive at the top of the file. So let's again go back. This page.tsx is currently in client component. Our actions file has a server action, and right here we define it as use server. So with that we say this is in server action. But since we now use it in an external file, instead of putting the directive into the function, we want to put it on the top. So now we have a file and on top it's marked as use server, and then we just create our standard functions inside of here. And now this function automatically will convert to a server action. I can also create inside of here another function like export async function yo. I can invoke it, open it, and this is also a server action. So again, if you want to create a server action in an external file, you want to mark the file on top as use server, and then all functions inside of here will be at the end of the day server actions. So now we understand all of that, which means we can now create our mutation. Let's delete the console log and let's again create our Prisma mutation. So let's do in constant data equals to await Prisma. Prisma is imported from the utils folder, .block post .create. Let's invoke it, destructured, let's get our data property, and as mentioned, we want to now pass our author name, author image, content, and stuff like that. Let's start with our title, and now the question is, how or where do we get our title from? We have our UI right here, we have our form, we have the input, but how do I get the value on the server side? Good question. Well, actually, we can get form data through our params. So let's get form data, and this will be of type form data. So now we have our form data, but the thing is, right now, our form data will be empty. So what we have to do is we have to provide names for our inputs. So for the first input for our title, we can provide a name which will be equal to title. Then we have our content. Let's also provide a name, and this will be equal to content. And then we have our URL. Let's provide a name, and this will be equal to URL. So these are the names, or these are the values which we will see in our form data. So now we can do in constant title, and this will be equal to form data.get. And what do we want to get? Well, we want to get an input with the name title. So we can pass it right here as an argument. Let's copy paste it 2 more times. I want to now get my content, meaning form data.get, and we want to get an input on text area with the name content. Let's paste it right here. And then I want to get an URL. So let's do form data.get, and I want to get an input with the name URL. Let's copy it and let's paste it right here. So now we have our title, content, and URL, and now we can use it for our mutation. So for the title, this will be equal to title. Then we have our content. This will be equal to content. Then we also have our image URL. This will be equal to our URL. As you see, we currently get a few errors, but don't worry about that. We will fix that in a second. Now, we want to also provide the author ID, author image, and author name. This means we want to get the session from kind, the user, and then from kind we can get the name, we can get the image, and we can get the ID. So above our constant title and stuff like that, we can again do in constant, we can do structured, and this will be equal to get kind server session. Let's import it and let's invoke it, and then I can get my get user function. Get user is in promise, so let's do in constant user equals to await get user. I want to invoke it, and now we have our user. This means I can now go underneath my image URL, I can get an author ID, and this will be equal to user.id. Then I want to also get an author image, and this will be equal to user.picture. And then we also have the author name, and this will be equal to our user.givenName. Okay, this is now finished. But now we get quite a few errors. So what's the problem? So if you hover over title, you will see type form data entry value is not assignable to type string. So what does this mean? Well, at the end of the day, form data or Prisma does not know if form data entry value is of type string or not. So this means in theory, you would want to right now do a bit of server-side validation. But the thing is, we don't have any time in this video to dive into server-side validation. So on the top corner, you will now see a pop-up of a video in which I talk about form validation, client-side and server-side validation. You can check it out after this tutorial, but for now, we can just mark it as string. So we can say for the title as string, for the content as string, and then for the image URL also as string. So with this, we now tell TypeScript, hey, we know that title is a string, we know that content is a string, and we know that URL is also of type string. Now we also get an error for the author image and author name, and it says type string or null is not assignable to type string. Now in this case, I know that author image is defined, so let's mark it as string, and the same is true for the author name. I know that it's defined, so let's mark it as string. And now we are finished with our mutation, and now I want to redirect the user. So let's do a return redirect. Redirect is imported from Next navigation. Please make sure that you import it from Next navigation and not from Next distribution. If you import it from Next distribution, you will get a lot of errors, and you don't want that. So let's import it from Next navigation, and I want to redirect the user to /dashboard. Okay, this is now finished. We get an error for data, that's fine, let's leave it like that. And I think we can now test out our submission. So I will save it, I will go back, let me do a hard refresh. And then for the title, this will be John Fisher. For the content, some gibberish. And then for the image, let me just copy this dummy URL right here. This is just an image from Google. Let me paste it inside of here. And then I want to create my post. So currently there's no pending state, no loading state, but I got redirected, which means it was successful. At least I hope so. So let's open Prisma Studio and let's double check. So if you go back, you will first of all also see in your terminal that we did an 303. This means we did an redirect. But now let's open a second terminal tab, and inside of here, let's do npm dlx Prisma Studio. And as you see, John Fisher with our content and the image, we have an author ID, we have the author name, an author image created at and updated at timestamp. This means our mutation was successful, and that's beautiful. That's exactly what I wanted. So since we're now finished with our mutation, I want to now fetch my blog articles in the dashboard and of course render them inside of here. So how do we get started? Well, we get started by fetching our data. So above the export default function, let's do an async function. This will be called getData. I want to invoke it and open it. Again, we can do that because this is a server component. Inside of here, let's do constant data equals to await Prisma. Prisma is imported from the utils folder .blog post.find many, since we want to find many articles. Now here's the thing, we want to use an where clause, a where statement. We don't want to find all blog articles. We want to only find the blog articles that the individual user created. This means, as you all know, if you again open your schema file, not this, but the schema file, we have an author ID. And now I only want to find blog articles where the author ID matches my user ID. So let's go to our dashboard, and inside of here again in the where statement, let's get our not user ID, but our author ID, and this should be equal to our user ID. But where do we get our user ID from? Well, we will get it through kind. So above our return statement, we can do in constant, let's the structured, and this will be equal to get kind server session. Let's invoke it. Then where I destructured, I can get the get user function, and as you all know, this is in promise. So let's do in constant user equals to await get user. Let's invoke it, and now we have our user. But as you know, we want to get the user ID inside of here. So here's what we'll do. We will get the user ID through the params. We can get an user ID, and this will be of type string. Then author ID will be equal to user ID. Later on, once we call the getData function, we will provide the argument, or we will provide the user ID as an argument. And you know what, we can do it right now. We can do in constant data equals to await get data. Let's invoke it, and now we get one error. And that's because we are expecting one argument, but we pass 0. So let's pass our user.id, and now this error is gone. So this now means we have created an async function getData. Inside of here we fetch data from Prisma with an where statement, meaning we only find blog posts where the author ID matches the user ID. We pass the user ID as an I guess, argument, so we get it through the params, we pass it right here, and then once we call the getData function in our export default function, we pass the user ID as an argument. Nice. Now let's also finish off our getData function, because there's still a few things missing. I want to add an order by statement. I want to order the results based on the created at timestamp. I want to get the newest ones first. So let's say created at, and as an option we get either ascending or descending. So we want to select descending because we want to get the newest results first. And as the last step, we want to now return our data. So let's do return data, and now this is finished. So our query is finished, our function is finished, we get our data, and now we can map over our data and render a blog post for the individual blog card, or for the individual blog post, yeah. So let's go underneath this wrapper div of the h2n link. Then let's create another div element. This will be the layout div for our block cards. So we want to have in grid layout. So let's give it a class name of grid columns of 1 on a mobile screen. Then on MD or bigger, we want to say grid columns of 2. Then on LG or bigger, let's do grid columns of 3. and then in gap of 4. And inside of here, we can now map over our data. So let's do data.map, let's get an item as a param, and then let's return it. For now, we can return a div with an h1, and I want to render the item.title. Then for the div, we want to provide a key. You have to always provide a unique key, and in this case, we will provide an item.id, since the ID is unique. Let's now save it, let's go back, let's do a hard refresh, and inside of here you see John Fisher. Nice. Let's now continue. So do we want to render an H1? Not really. I want to render a beautiful card. So here's what we'll do. We will create a separate component, and inside of there we will create a card UI. So for that, let's open our Explorer. Let's go to the components folder. Where do we have it? Right here. Let's go to the general folder and let's create a block post card.tsx. Since this is a component, let's do an export function block post card. Let's invoke it and let's open it. Inside of here, let's do a return statement and let's return a div element. Now here's the thing, this video isn't a Tailwind class or a Tailwind tutorial. This video isn't a styling tutorial either. This means I will go through this relatively quickly. I won't explain to you what a flex element is, what grid is, what a border color is. I expect you to know that. This is a Next.js tutorial. So let's give this div a class name. Let's say group, then let's do a relative element. Then let's give it an overflow of hidden so that nothing overflows. Let's do rounded of LG, and right here, these are the styles for our card itself. That's why we give a rounding and we'll give it a border color and stuff like that. So now let's also say border, then let's do a border of gray 200, because I don't like the default color, to be honest. Let's do a BG of white, shadow of MD, because 2XL is a bit too much. And let's also do a transition of all, and let's do a hover of shadow LG. Then of course we want to allow the user to at the end of the day click on the card, and we want to redirect the user, so let's use our link component. This is imported from next/link. Let's open it. For the link we want to provide an href, and now here's the thing, the href will be dynamic, right? Each block article at the end of the day is unique, it has a unique ID. So that's why we want to use upticks, and I want to redirect the user to /post and then /the post ID. Currently we don't get the ID, so how can I pass the ID right here? Because as you know, we don't fetch any data inside of here. Well, we will pass the item later on right here as a prop. So we can create an interface. So let's do an interface and let's call it iAppProps. And inside of here, I can define what I want to get. So if you go back to the dashboard and hover over your data, you see what types we get. ID, title, content, stuff like that. Let's copy everything and let's paste it right here. So now we expect an ID, a title, an author name, author image, stuff like that. And now right now we expect everything individually, but we don't want to get it individually. Let's get it like in a data object and let's paste it right here. So now we expect a data object with an ID and stuff like that. So now this is finished, and now we can go to our params, we can destructure it, and this will be of type iAppProps. And then where we destructured, we get our data. So now I can paste my ID, or I can pass my ID. So let's get our data.id. Alright, our link is now finished. And then for our link, let's also provide a class name of block, and let's say width of full and height of full. And now in the link, I want to render an image. How do you render an image in Next.js? Now you might say, Jan, what a stupid question. You just use the image tag. But if I use it, I get an error. An ESLint error. So it says using image or using the image tag could result in lower LCP and higher bandwidth. Consider using the image component from Next image. Huh? What's that? Let's go to the documentation. So Next.js offers a feature which is the image component, and this image component at the end of the day extends the native HTML image element with features for automatic image optimization, like for example size optimization, visual stability, faster page loads, and asset flexibility. Now here's the thing, this is a feature provided at the end of the day by Vercel. This isn't really a Next.js feature, but more a Vercel feature. So this also means it has a cost behind it. You have like 500 free image optimizations, I'm not sure, but after that you'll have to upgrade to the Pro plan. Nevertheless, it's always recommended to use the image component, and for example my website janmarshall.com uses the image component. I get about 10,000 or more users per month, so it's more than enough, to be honest with you, the limit, the free limit. So let's use the image component. So we can convert the image to an image component, import it from Next.image, and then for the source we want to pass our data.image URL. Let's also provide an alt. We will say image hero or image for block, and then that's already all. So now we are finished with the image, and if I save it and go back, you won't see anything. And that's because this component is currently not rendered in the page. So let's go to the page, let's go to the section where we map over our data, and instead of returning in div, let's return our block post card. Let's import it from the components. Currently we get an error. That's because we have to pass one required property, which is the data. For the data, this will be equal to our item. But now we get one more error. What's the problem? Well, we are missing the key iterator, and this will be equal to our item.id. Let's now save it. Let's go back. Let's do a hard refresh. And now we have an error. What's the problem? Image with source is missing required width property. So whenever you use the image component in Next.js, you have to provide a width and height property so that Next.js knows how it should pretty much optimize your image, because again, the image component optimizes your image, right? And to optimize it to the correct size, Next.js first of all has to know what size the image has. So there are two ways to fix the problem. Either or option one is to provide a width and to provide a height, as they mention in the error problem thing right here. Or another solution is to use a wrapper div and then pass in fill property. And that's what we will do. We can delete this width and height, we won't use that. Instead, let me wrap my image component in a div. Let's again paste the image, and then for the div, let's give it a class name. Now it's super important that you give it a relative class, because if you don't pass it, it won't work. Then let's also do a height of 48, let's do a width of full, and an overflow of hidden. Then for our image, as mentioned, we can now pass in fill property, and if I save it and go back, this error will go away. But now we have a new problem. Invalid source prop on next image, hostname is not configured. What's the problem? So again, as mentioned, the image component optimizes your images. This also means that you have some sort of resource cost behind it, because you have to optimize your image to a specific size. But now here's the following. Let's imagine a malicious user comes and says, hey, this user optimizes images for free. Why don't I just pass my own URL and then this user will optimize images for me? Isn't that great? Well, to prevent something like that, you can add this hostname to your next.config file and whitelist it. This means we will only allow images with this hostname to be optimized. If a malicious user comes and passes the URL, I don't care about your money.com, then we won't optimize this image or these images, videos or whatever. So now let's copy this hostname. So encrypt tbn You probably have a different hostname, it does not matter. Then let's go to our next.config file, and then inside of here we want to get an images property. Let's open it. Inside of here we will get a remote patterns property. This is an array, and then in the array let's open an object. So inside of here we want to now pass the core details of the URL of the hostname pretty much. So let's first of all pass the hostname. This will be this URL which I just copied from the error. Then we want to also provide our protocol. This will be HTTPS. And then we want to also provide a port, and the port will just be an empty string. So now this is finished. Let's save it. If you open your terminal, you'll see that this will automatically again restart, which is great. Whenever you make a change in the next.config file, you have to always restart your dev server. Meaning if this hasn't restarted automatically, please do it manually. But for me, everything worked as expected, which is nice. But now we have one problem. this image does not look very nice. So let's style it. Let me close this, let's go to our blog post card and let's add a class name. Let's say object of cover, then I want to give it in transition of transform, and then let's do a duration of 300, and then let's also do a group hover, and this will have a scale of 105. If I now save it and again go back, we now have our image, and if I hover on it, you see we have this little scale effect, which looks beautiful. Now I want to render my content, so let's again go back. Let's go underneath our wrapper div, but let's stay in the link component, and let's create a new div element. Let's give it a class name of padding 4, and inside of here, let's render an h3, and I want to render my data.title. If I save it and go back, you now see John Fisher. This does not look very nice, so let's add a class name, and this will be margin bottom of 2, text of LG, font of semi-bold, and text gray of 900. If I save it and again go back, you now see this already looks way better. Let's now also render our description, so let's go back underneath the h3. I want to render a p tag, and inside of here I can get my data.content. If I save it and go back, you now see the description right here. Let's update the style a bit, so let's add a class name, and we want to give it a margin bottom of 4, then a text of small, and a text of gray 600. If I save it and again go back, you now see that this looks quite nice. But now let's imagine the following. For the content, the user writes an essay, 1000 words. In this case, we would render everything right here. We don't want that. We want to have like a maximum line or a maximum amount of lines. So for example, 2 or 3 or 4 or something like that. So to achieve something like that with Tailwind CSS, it's relatively simple. We can add a line clamp, and this will be 2, meaning the maximum amount of lines will be 2. You could also say line clamp of 3, then you will have a maximum amount of lines of 3. Who would have thought? So let's leave it at 2. I think that's a bit better. If you go back, nothing will change. Everything still works. And that's nice. So now I want to render my author info, meaning the name, image, and stuff like that. So let's go underneath the p tag and let's create another div element. Let's give it a class name, and this will be flex, items of center, and justify of between. So this means we at the end of the day align our children to the most outer corners, the left side and the right side. Then inside of here, let's render another div element. Let's give it a class name, and this will be flex, items of center, and space x of 2. This is for our first child, meaning the left side. And then inside of here, we will render another div element. I know, quite funny, so many divs, but this is the wrapper div for our image, meaning we will again pass in relative class, and then we will pass for the image the fill property. So let's add a div element, let's give it a class name, and as mentioned, this is relative, super important. Let's do a size of 8, meaning height of 8 and width of 8, and let's do an overflow of hidden. Then let's also do a rounded or full, and inside of here, I want to get my image component. Again, with the image component, we optimize the images, which is cool. Then inside of here, let's provide a source. For the source, this will be our data.author image. Let's also provide an alt, because this is required, and this will be equal to our data.author name. Then let's also provide our fill property and a class name of object cover. If I save it and again go back, we have a new error. What's the problem? Well, again, we now render our logo. Our logo is generated, or pretty much generated, from Google, right? We get the URL from Google OAuth, from kind. And this URL has a new host name, Google User Content. We want to again whitelist this domain, so let's copy the host name lh3.googleUserContent. I will copy it, then let me open my next config file. Then I want to create a new object inside of my remote patterns. Let's provide a host name. For the host name, I will paste what I just copied. And then we have our protocol. This will be HTTPS. And we also have the port, and this will be an empty string. Okay, this is finished, and if I now go back, my dev server will again restart. As you now see, on the bottom left corner, we now render my logo, which is great. But now I want to also render the author name, meaning Jan. So let's again go back. I want to go underneath this div, which wraps our image, and inside of here, I want to provide I want to render an p element, an p tag. Inside of here, let's get our data.author name, and if I save it and again go back, you see Jan. Let's also style it. So for the p tag, I will give it a class name of text small, font of medium, and then I want to also provide a text of gray 700. If I save it and again go back, you see this looks quite nice. Let's now also render the created at timestamp on the right side. So let's go back. I want to go underneath this div, and then inside of here, we can get a time element. Let's delete the date time, and let's provide a class name of text XS and text of gray 500. So this time element is just a semantic HTML. You can also use a div. To be honest, I don't care. We will use time, why not? Inside of here, I want to now render my date. So let's get our data.createdAt, and as you now see, we get an error. What's the problem? Well, created at is an object, right? At the end of the day, it's a date object, and you can't render objects in JSX. So let's do the following. Let's do a toString. Let's invoke it. Let's go back and yeah, I don't think so, man. This looks ugly. Let's again delete that. So let's delete the toString and let's format our date. Now, how do you format a date in JSX or in React? Some people might install some sort of weird package, datefns or something like that, but we don't have to do that. We can use the native JavaScript API for that. So let's do new international, new lowercase, then international is uppercase, .date time format. Then let's invoke it. Inside of here, I want to pass my locale, which is en-uppercase US. And then I want to add a comma and I can open an object. Inside of here, we want to pass in year. This will be numeric. Then I want to pass in month. This will be short. And for the day, this will be also numeric. Then at the end, we want to, of course, format our date. So let's do dot, and this will be format. And as an argument, we can provide our data.createdAt. If I save it and again go back, you now see March 3rd, 2025. Nice, this is now also finished. Let's create another blog article and let's see if it's also rendered inside of here. So I will click on create post for the title. Hey, this is a cool test. Then for the content, to test my line clamp, let me write a lot of gibberish. As you now see, I've generated quite a bit of content right here. Let's now also add an image URL. I will paste my dummy image and then let me create a post. As you now see, we got redirected and now we have, hey, this is a cool test. Very nice. So now we are kind of finished right here, right? We now can create posts and then we render them right here. Let's maybe also quickly again go to the create post. If I create a post, as you just saw, we don't have a pending state for the submit button. I don't really like that. This looks kind of ugly. This isn't good user experience. So let's change that. I want to show in pending state. So to show in pending state, when you use server actions, you have to create a separate component. This is mandatory. You have to do that because you will have to use a very special hook. So let's open our Explorer. Let's go to the components, general, and let's create a submit button.tsx. So inside of here, we can do an export function. This will have a name of submit button, and then let's invoke it and open it. Inside of here, we can do a return statement, and as mentioned, we want to return again a button. Let's import it from the components, and let's say submit. But now you might say, okay, Jan, this is just a hard-coded button which says submit, whereas the pending magic, where do we get the status from? Well, to get the status of our form submission, we have to use a hook which is called useFormStatus. So let's do the following. Let's do a constant, let's the structured, and this will be equal to useFormStatus. Now, please make sure that you import useFormStatus and not useFormState. So useFormStatus is a React hook. This isn't really something Next.js specific. This is a React hook, so you probably already know it or know the hook. Nevertheless, this hook at the end of the day gives us the status of our form submission. So if it's pending or not. So let's invoke it, and then where I destructured, I can get my pending state. So now we have our pending state, which means we can do internally. We can say, hey, if pending is true, then let's just return submitting. If not, let's use a colon and let's return submit. Nice. So now we have our pending text. Let's also style our button a little bit. Let's give it a class name of wFit, and then let's add a type of submit. And then I want to also add a disabled state, and this will be equal to pending. So this right here means, hey, if pending is true, then disabled will be true. If pending is false, then disabled will be false. So now we have our submit button. I can copy it, and let's open our create route. Instead of now rendering the create post button, we can render our submit button. This is imported from the components. This of course is also self-closing. Let's save it and let's delete this button import. We don't need it anymore. So currently everything will work. That's because this page is a client component. Let me delete the use client directive at the top. So now we have a server component right here. The form is in server component and our submit button is also in server component. If I now save this and again go back, we get an error. Why is that? Well, at the end of the day, this use from status hook relies on a JavaScript bundle. But since now this submit button does not really get this use client directive anymore from the page.tsx, we get an error. If our page.tsx is marked as use client, everything works. That's because the page is a client component. But now our page is a server component, which means we have to mark our submit button with the use client directive. So now the page.tsx is a server component and the submit button is a client component because use from status relies on a JavaScript bundle. Let's now save it, let's go back, and if I do a hard refresh, everything still works. Let's provide a title, content, and let me paste my image URL. So let me now click on submit and we have our pending state. It's disabled, so the button is disabled, and now we got redirected, and inside of here you see 3 blog articles. Nice. So now we are finished with our dashboard. So we now fetch data, our mutation works, we have this beautiful pending state. Everything works as expected. Nevertheless, there's currently one huge security mistake which we made, and you probably don't even know it, and most people who use Next.js on a daily basis also won't know this security mistake. So currently, to create our mutation, we use server actions, right? We have our actions file, we do our export async function, then we fetch our data, or we get our data from our form data, and we create our mutation. Basic code. There's nothing wrong with this code itself. It's fine. Everything works. That's nice. Sure, you could add a bit of error handling, server-side validation, stuff like that. But this isn't like a major problem right now. The major problem is that this server action is actually a public endpoint. And most people don't know it. So right here in the documentation you see by default when a server action is created and exported, it creates a public HTTP endpoint and it should be treated with the same security assumptions and authorization checks. This means even if a server action or utility function is not imported elsewhere in your code, it's still publicly accessible. So this means we want to protect the server action. We want to only allow authenticated users to create a submission. So currently we already fetch our user right here, right? Using kind. This means we can create an if check. So underneath our constant user equals to await get user, let's create an if statement and we will say, hey, if we don't have a user with an exclamation mark, then let's do return redirect, and we want to redirect the user to /API/auth/register. Meaning if there's no valid user session, we will redirect the user to our route handler, and our route handler will redirect the user to the hosted authentication page provided by kind. So now our server action is safe and there are no problems anymore inside of here. Currently also we get an error for data, and that's because it's declared but not used. So let's just say await prisma.blogpost.create. So now this server action is safe. Of course, again, you would want to also add server-side validation, a bit of error handling, but I guess the core security problem is now fixed. In the server action, we now check that the user has an valid session, and if so, this user can create the mutation. So now we can close our server action file. This is finished. And now let's continue right here. So as mentioned, the dashboard is finished, right? But there's one little problem. So right here in our dashboard, we fetch our data, right? Again, this code is fine. Nothing is wrong with the code. But let's imagine that our data is very, very big and it takes a long time to fetch our data. So right now our data is super fast. If I click on Command R, so for a hard refresh, we have our data instantly. That's because we don't have a lot of data which we fetch. But let's imagine that we right here would fetch thousands of blog articles. Then fetching the data wouldn't take a few milliseconds, but it would now take a few seconds. And this is very bad user experience. So let me show it to you. I will create a fake delay right here and let's say 2000 milliseconds, meaning 2 seconds. If I now again go back and do a hard refresh, you see 1 second, 2 seconds, and then we only get the data. As you see, it's quite slow and it's also quite bad in terms of user experience because you don't give the user any feedback. The user does not know if your website already works or not. So this means we can now implement something which is called streaming. What is streaming? Good question. So Next.js server components natively support streaming. So there's a special file called loading.js, and this helps you create meaningful loading UI with React Suspense. With this convention, you can show an instant loading state from the server while the content of a route segment loads. The content is automatically swapped in once rendering is complete. Interesting. Let me maybe dumb it down even further. So again, our data right here has a delay of 2 seconds. This means we have to now wait 2 seconds and then only this whole page loads. This means we have like a quite big blocking event. But what is if we could render this data, meaning our navbar, instantly and then show a loading state for our blog articles? This is what streaming is. You render your shell instantly, meaning your navbar, and then you render your content, or in other words, you stream your content, meaning once your data comes in, you swap it. So you first of all show a loading state, and then once your data has finished loading, you swap it against your actual content. So if this currently confuses you, don't worry. Let's first of all implement everything, and once we have implemented streaming, you'll see how easy it is. So as mentioned, Next.js has a special file called loading.js, or in other words, loading.tsx. And as you know, we want to create a loading file for our dashboard index page. So let's create a loading.tsx. Please make sure that you spell it correctly. And then inside of here, since this is now in route, we can do an export default function. Let's call it loading dashboard. Let's invoke it and then we can open it. Inside of here, we can create a return statement. So as an example, let's just render a p tag and let's say hello. Let's now save it. Let's go back and let's do a hard refresh. And as you see, we say hello, 1, 2, and then we see our data. So this is what streaming is. We stream our data, we show an instant loading state, hello, and once our data has finished loading, we swap our loading state for our actual content. This gives the user instant feedback. The user sees, hey, the website loads, the data will be there soon. Again, let's do a hard refresh. You see the navbar has loaded and now we render our content itself. This means we don't block anything from rendering. Our navbar is super quick. We first of all render the navbar and then our blog articles are streamed into view. Nice. Now, of course, you can also make it look a bit nicer. So we could, for example, use the skeleton component provided by Shadsi and UI. This is like a loading, pulsing thing. I'm not sure how you want to call it, but let's install it. Let's copy the pnpm script. I will open my terminal, I will paste it inside of here, and then let me again restart my dev server. Then instead of returning a p tag, we can return our skeleton component. This is self-closing. We can give it a class name of wfull and maybe a height of custom value 400 pixels. If I save it and again go back and do a hard refresh, you'll now see a little skeleton right here, and then we will see our cards in a second, as you see right here. But here's also one thing which I want to mention. This loading file is only an UI file. You can't fetch any data inside of here, you can't create any mutations inside of here, nothing which is dynamic. Inside of here, you just create your fallback, meaning skeleton components, h1s, divs, class names, stuff like that. This all works, but this isn't a dynamic route, only a static route where you create your UI, which you render as a fallback. Again, this is our fallback. So now we've implemented streaming using the loading file. It was super quick and super easy. But as mentioned, you can also implement streaming the native way, meaning using the suspense component. Currently, the loading file creates suspense boundaries automatically on the top and bottom, meaning you suspend pretty much the whole page. But sometimes you want to have it more granular. Maybe you want to suspend only a particular section. Maybe you don't want to suspend the whole page. And in this case, you would want to use a native or a manual suspense boundary. In there, you can choose yourself where you want to put the suspense boundary, and then you pass your fallback. So in this case, our loading file is this fallback. So for the suspense boundary, we pass in fallback. This is our fallback. And then Next.js automatically creates the suspense boundaries again at the top and bottom. So now let's use the native approach, meaning let's use the suspense components. Let's go to our index page, to the page.tsx. Right here we fetch our data and then we map over our data, right? And currently we render an h1 element. This does not look nice, meaning if I go to my index page again, you see we currently just render the titles. Let's fix that. So let's again go back. Instead of rendering the h1, let's render our blog post card. This is imported from the components. For our data, let's pass our item and let's pass in key, and this will be our item.id. And as you see, we currently get an error for data, and that's because we are missing author ID and updated at. So you know what, let me just select the author ID, let's set it to true, and let's get the updated at timestamp. Let's also set it to true. So now we don't get any errors anymore. And again, why do we even get this error? Well, if you open your blog post card, right here we expect an updated ad and also our author ID. So that's why I had to now select it right here. So now let's save it. Let's go back, and as you see, we have an error. Failed to parse source, ASD or next image. What's the problem? Well, if you open Prisma Studio, you see we have 4 records, and one record does not have an image URL. So right here it's just ASD This was the demo record. So let me just delete this row, delete one record, yes, deleted, and now this error will go away. Meaning if I do a hard refresh, you'll now see we have 3 blog articles. So since this now works as expected, we can now add our manual suspense boundaries. So what I want to do is I want to only suspend my blog articles, meaning I want to render my navbar, I want to render my latest posts, the h1, but I want to suspend my blog articles. So here's the thing. Let's first of all create our fake delay of 2 seconds. If I again do a hard refresh, you now see we have a delay of 2 seconds, and then we get our data. This is again a blocking event, meaning our navbar is not rendered, our latest post is not rendered, nothing is rendered. We have to wait 2 seconds until everything renders. So let's add our manual suspense boundaries. I want to only suspend my blog posts. So how do you do that? Good question. It's actually relatively simple. So currently we have 2 functions, right? We have our async function getData, where we fetch our data. Oh, and let me take my glasses off. So we have our async function where we fetch our data, and then we have our export default function, which is also asynchronous, where we await our data. And what we want to now do is we want to create one more function which now awaits our data. So the export default function should now not be asynchronous anymore. Instead, we will have one more function which will be asynchronous, which will await our data, because suspense boundaries don't work in asynchronous components. So again, if this currently confuses you, don't worry, it will be relatively simple once we implement it. So let's do an async function. Let's call it blog posts, or we could say let's call it blog posts. Let's invoke it and let's open it. As mentioned, inside of here, I want to await my data. So let's do constant data equals to await get data. Let's invoke it. So now we get our data inside of here, and now we can return it. So let's do a return statement, and I want to only return my div and then where we map over our data. So let's copy this div and let's paste it inside of here. So now we have our data, we map over it, and then we render our blog post card. So now we have the function blog posts. This means I can render it in our export default function home. So let's just render our blog posts. This is self-closing. And then we can delete from our export default function the async modifier. And also we don't want to get our data anymore. So now let's again look at our code. We have an async function getData. Inside of here, we fetch our data. Then we have an async function blog posts. Inside of here, we await our data, and then we render pretty much our blog posts. We have a div which creates the layout, and then we just map over our data and we render the blog post card. Then we have an export default function. This is the route itself. This isn't asynchronous, this is in standard just server component, which is rendered pretty much instantly. And then inside of here, we render our h1, and then we have our blog posts. Again, blog posts is the function where we await our data. So currently nothing will change. This means if I go back and do a hard refresh, the core, I guess, data, loading, structure, whatever, the UI is still the same. Everything is still the same. Everything works exactly the same. We just changed up the structure of the code. But since we now did the structure change, we can now use suspense boundaries, because again, suspense boundaries don't work in an async function. So in our export default function, what do we want to suspend? Well, we want to suspend our blog posts. This means we can get our suspense component from React, and then inside of here we can pass our blog posts. Now for the suspense, we want to add a fallback. And for now, I can add a fallback of a standard p tag. Let me say hello waiting. Let's now save it. Let's go back. I will do a hard refresh and hello waiting. Nice. So this now means that we only suspend our blog posts. As you see again, if I do a hard refresh, we see our navbar, we see our latest posts, and we only suspend our blog cards itself. Nice. So as you now see, there are two ways to add streaming in your Next.js application. First of all, there's the native Next.js way. This means that you can add a loading file. This loading file will automatically create suspense boundaries on the top and bottom, and you just create the fallback UI inside of here. Or there's the more granular, the more manual approach where you create your own suspense boundaries and then you add your fallback right here. Now, I personally always recommend you to use manual suspense boundaries. It's more granular and it's in most cases better for your application, because we can now render our h1 right here and then we suspend only this one section with our blog articles. But yeah, nice. You now know how streaming works, and as you see, it's super easy in Next.js. So now what's the next thing which I want to do? Well, I want to create the ID route for our blog articles, because if I currently click on the card, we will get redirected, but we get an error. So let's fix that. So if you open your blog post card, you'll see that for the link we passed an href, and the href is post and then a dynamic value, the ID. So let's create the corresponding route. Let's open the Explorer, let's go to the app folder, and we want to create a new route. The new route will be post. So let's create a post folder, and then this post folder will have a child folder, a dynamic route, meaning our ID. How do you create again a dynamic route in Next.js? Well, you use array brackets and then you pass the name, which you then reference using your params. In this case, ID makes the most sense. And then for the ID folder, let's create a page.tsx. So now we have our route, and since this is a route, let's do an export default function. I will call it ID page. I will invoke it and then we can open it. Now inside of here, let's first of all fetch our data. So on top, let's do an async function. This will be get post, or let's call it get data. I like it a bit more. Let's invoke it and let's open it. Inside of here, I want to fetch data with Prisma. So let's do a constant data equals to await Prisma. Prisma is imported from the utils folder, .blog post, .find unique, since I want to only find one specific blog post. Let's invoke it, that's the structured, and inside of here we want to add an where statement. I don't want to find any blog post. Again, I want to find one specific blog post, and we will find the blog post using the ID. So in our params, we want to get an ID, and this will be of type string. So let's pass for the ID our ID. As in last step, let's return our data, and now our async function is finished. Then inside of here, I want to now await my data. So let's do constant data, and this will be equal to await get data. But now you'll see that we get 2 errors. First of all, await expressions are only allowed within async functions. So let's mark the function as asynchronous. And why is this safe to do so? You should know it, it's a server component. And now for get data, we want to pass 1 argument. It expects 1 argument, but we pass 0. What's the argument? The argument is the ID, meaning the ID, which we have right here in our folder, right, in our route. So how do we get it? Well, you should all know it from the start of the video. We can get it through our params. So let's first of all create a type. Let's call it params. Params will be equal to a promise, because as mentioned in Next.js 15, your params are now asynchronous. Then inside of here, let's pass in generic, let's open an object, and we want to get an ID, which will be of type string. Now again, if you forgot, this naming, the ID, has to correspond to your folder name. If this dynamic route has a name of hello, you want to get hello right here. If this has a name of yo, you want to get yo right here. But since this has a name of ID, we want to get an ID right here. Quite simple, right? And since we now have our type, we can now destructure our params. Let's get our params, and this will have a type, which will be params of type params. Nice. If you now hover over params, you will see that params is of type params. So since we now have that, we can now await it, because again, our params is in promise. So let's do constant, let's destructure it, and this will be equal to await params. And then where I destructure it, I can get my ID. And then as an argument, let's now pass this ID. So this now works, this is great. Nevertheless, we have one problem. If you hover over data, it says data could be of type right here, this object with ID, title, stuff like that. But it could be also null, because right here it says or null. But if we don't get any data, I want to pretty much return in for not found. And again, we could get an error because, for example, a user passes in wrong ID. And if we don't find any blog post, I want to return in for not found. How do you do that in Next.js? Well, thankfully, it's super simple. Right here where we fetch data, we can create an if statement, and we will say, hey, if we don't get any data, then let's return not found. Not found is imported from Next navigation. And now we can invoke it, and now we are finished. Meaning, if we don't get any data, we will return in for not found. And now let's test it out. So let me go inside of our export default function. Let's create a return statement, and let's return in div h1, and I want to render my data.title. If I save it and again go back and do a hard refresh, we should now see the title right here. And yes, you see, hey, this is a cool test. But now let's update our URL, and for the ID, I will pass some gibberish. And if I click on enter, we have in for not found. So this is this not found function in full effect. If we don't have any data, we return in for not found. Let's now finish off this ID route, and again, this isn't a tyrant course, so I will go through this relatively quickly. Let's return first of all in div, let's give it a maximum width of 3xl, then let's do an mx of auto to center it, and a padding y of 8 and a padding x of 4. Inside of here, let's render a link component, imported from Next link. If the user clicks on the link, I want to redirect the user to the dashboard. So let's pass the href property, and for the URL, this will be /dashboard. As in value, let's just say back to posts. And if I save it and again go back, you now see back to posts. This does not look very nice, so let's add a class name. So for the link, I will add a class name of button variants. Let's invoke it, and let's also pass in variant, and this will be secondary. If I save it and again go back, you now see this looks quite nice. Let's now continue with our post header. So I will go back, let's go underneath the link component, and let's render a div. Let's give the div a class name of margin bottom 8 and margin top 6. Then inside of here, I want to render an h1, and I want to render the data.title. If I save it and again go back, you now see the title right here. This title does not look very nice, so let's style it. Let's give it a class name of text3xl, font of bold, and tracking of tight. Let's also do a margin bottom of 4, and now this is finished. Let's now continue. Let's go back, and underneath the h1 I want to render a div. Let's give this div a class name of flex, items of center, and space x of 4. Inside of here I want to render another div element, and let's give it a class name of flex, items of center, and let's do a space x of 2. Then in this div, let's render another div. I know a lot of divs, but this div will be the wrapper div for our image. So again, later on for our image, we will add an fill property. When you use an fill property, you have to have a wrapper div which has a relative class name. So let's give this div a class name of relative. Let's do a size of 10. I want to have an overflow of hidden so that nothing overflows, and then a rounded or full. This is for my image, my logo, I guess. So for the author image. Inside of here, I want to get the image component for next/image, and then I want to pass in source. This source will be our data.author image. And then let's also pass an alt. This will be our data.author name, and let's also provide our fill property. If I now save it and again go back, you now see my image right here. Let's give the image also a class name of object cover. So this is now finished, and now I want to also render the name of the author, so the author name. For that, we can go underneath the wrapper div for our image, but still in the div with the space x of 2. Let's render a p tag, and inside of here, I want to get my data.author name. Let's also provide a class name, and this will be font of medium. If I again go back, you now see my image and then Jan. Let's now also render when this post was created. This means we can go underneath this div with the space x2, but still in the div with the space x4. And inside of here, I want to render another p tag, and then I want to render my data.createdAt. As you now see, we get an error, and that's because createdAt is at the end of the day an object, right? A date object. This means we want to format our date. For that, we have a JavaScript API. So let's do new international uppercase .datetime format. Let's invoke it. For the locale, this will be en-uppercase US. Let's add a comma. Let's open an object. Then for the year, this will be numeric. For the month, this will be long. And then let's also add a day, which will also be numeric. So now this is finished. Let's also format our date. So let's do .format, and we want to pass our data.createdAt. Let's also add a class name for our p tag. And here let's just say text of small and then text of gray 500. If I now save it and again go back, you'll now see right here that we have our image, my name, and then we have the date when this post was created. Nice. Let's now continue. So as a next step, I want to now render the post image, right? So the thumbnail URL. For that, let's go underneath this div with margin bottom 8 and margin top 6, so just above the last div. And then inside of here, we can again create a div. This will be the wrapper div for our image. Again, we have to add a class name of relative. Then let's add a height of custom value 400 pixels. Now, if you didn't know, with Tailwind CSS, you can create custom values by using these array brackets. Then let's also do a width of full, margin bottom of 8, and let me also add an overflow of hidden, and then a rounded of LG. In the div, I can now render my image component, and then let's provide a source, which will be our data.image URL. Let's also provide an alt, which will be our data.title, and let's provide our fill property. If I now save it and again go back, you now see the image right here. But now we have one problem. The fit is not really correct. So let's again go back and let's add a class name, and this will be object of cover. Let's save it, let's go back, and this is already way better. But now there's one thing which I haven't mentioned. So this image is pretty much like an hero image, right? meaning it should load relatively quickly. But if you open your inspector and if you go to the network tab and if you do a hard refresh, you'll see we first of all load our HTML. This is this document. Then we fetch our CSS. Then we fetch some JavaScript. And then at some point at the bottom, we only fetch our image. So right now the image has a relatively low priority. But in this case, our image should have a high priority. It should load relatively quickly. This means for our image component, we can add a priority property. And if I now save this and again go back, we can open our inspector. Let's go to our network tab. And here you now see we first of all fetch our HTML, then our font, then our CSS file, and then we already fetch our image. So now our image is fetched within priority, meaning it's loaded and rendered faster. Let's now also render our content. So let's again go back. Let's go underneath our div. Let me get my card component from the components. Then inside of here, I want to get my card content. And in the card content, I can render a p tag. And I want to render my data.content. And now let's save it. Let's go back. And now we have content right here in a card component. So this works nicely. Let's maybe also change the font color a bit, the text color. So let's add a class name of text gray 700. Let's again go back. And yeah, I think this is great. So to be honest, I think we are now finished. We have our link. If I click on the link, we get redirected to the dashboard. This shouldn't happen. I made a small mistake. I want to redirect the user to the index page. So let's again change that. So if I now click on back to posts, we get redirected to the index page. And then we have our block cards. Let's again go back to the dashboard. Then we have our core info, meaning the title, author name, author image, the created ad timestamp. Then we have an image and the content. But now there's only one thing which I don't like. So for our index page, if I do a hard refresh, our fallback only says hello waiting. This of course does not look very nice. So here's what we'll do. Creating a custom fallback would be very time consuming right now. So please go to my GitHub repo and then just copy paste it. So I have right here now pasted in function blog post grid, and inside of here at the end of the day we have our div with our grid layout, we have an array with a length of 6, and then right here this is in skeleton which pretty much mimics our card. As you see, this is only an UI component, no fetching, no asynchronous stuff, nothing. This will be the fallback for our suspense boundary. So again, div, array, and then the UI for our card. And now we can copy the name, blog posts grid, and let's paste it right here for our suspense boundary. So we have our fallback, let's delete the p tag, and instead I want to render my blog posts grid. This is self-closing, let's save it, let's go back, let me do a hard refresh, and inside of here you now see our blog posts as in fallback, meaning we have this beautiful skeleton. Okay friends, I guess we are now kinda finished. We now know what Next.js is, we know how to install it, we know how the project directory works and how it looks like, we know what in page.tsx is, we know what in layout.tsx is, we understand the basics of routing, static routes, dynamic routes. Then we also now understand the difference between client components, server components. We know how to fetch data. We know how to mutate data. We know how to suspend our data, meaning how to implement streaming. We know how to implement authentication with kind. We know what middleware is. There are a lot of things which we just learned about. Nevertheless, there are still 2 more things missing. We want to now learn, first of all, how to deploy our application to Vercel. And once our application is deployed, we will also cover caching, because caching is very important in Next.js, specifically in the app router. So as a first step, we want to now first of all deploy our application. As mentioned, we want to deploy our application to Vercel. But to deploy our application to Vercel, we will first of all have to create a new Git repository and store all of our data in the Git repository. So let's head over to github.com/new. Let's create a new repository. For the repository name, this will be Next.js 15 tutorial. Then I will make this repository public, and then I can create my repository. As you see, our repository is now created, and right here we have like a quick start guide. But let's skip it for now. Let's go back, let's open our terminal, let me stop my dev server, let's clear everything, and let's do git init. This will reinitialize our git repository. Then let's do git add everything with a dot, so git add dot. Now we want to commit everything, so let's do git commit -m, and for the message this will be finished code. Let's click on enter. Now we are almost finished. The next step is to create a branch with the name main. So let's copy it. Let's paste it right here. Then the next step is to add our remote origin. Let's copy it. Let's paste it. And the last step is to push our code. Let's copy the command and let's paste it inside of here. Okay, our Git repository is now pushed to GitHub. This means if I do a hard refresh, we will see our code right here. Very cool. Let's now head over to Vercel and deploy our code. So I'm now at vercel.com/new, and inside of here we want to now deploy our application. So let's import Next.js 15 tutorial, and before you now click on deploy, there's still one thing which we have to do. So right here we have environment variables. Currently these are empty, but as you know we have quite a lot of environment variables for kind and for our database URL. So let's copy all of them and let's paste them right here for our environment variables. Let's now deploy our application. As you now see, our application is deploying and this will take a minute or so. We will probably get an error. Nevertheless, if we get an error, we will fix it together. Alright, as you now see, we got an error and it says type error, parameter item implicitly has an any type. This is for our dashboard page.tsx. Let's open it. Right here, I don't see any error. If I hover over my item, we have a type. This isn't of type any. What's the problem? So sadly, Next.js right here throws a very bad error. This error does not help us. The problem or the reason why we get this error is because of Prisma. So when you install or when you deploy your application to your cell and you have Prisma installed, you want to run Prisma generate when you deploy your application, when you build your application. But currently, Vercel does not do that. So please go to Google and right here we can search for Vercel Prisma deployment. Let's click on enter and let's click on the first result. So right here you'll see Vercel will automatically cache dependencies on deployment. For most applications this will not cause any issues. However, for Prisma ORM, this will result in an outdated version of Prisma client on a change in your Prisma schema. To avoid this issue, add Prisma generate to the post-install script of your installation. Meaning, in short, to fix our problem, we want to add a post-install script with Prisma generate. So whenever Vercel builds our application, it will also run Prisma generate. Let's copy the command, let's go back, let's open our package.json, let's go underneath the lint and let's paste it right here. We want to now again push our code, so let's do git add everything with a dot, then let's do git commit -m, and for the message we will say added post install. Then let's click on enter, and then as a last step, let's do git push to push our code to GitHub. Vercel will now see that our code has updated and it will also automatically rebuild our application. So right here you now see we have one deployment which is currently building. We can also open our build logs and then you see more information inside of here. Nevertheless, let's now wait again for 1 minute or so. If we get an error, we will check it out together. Let's wait for the result. We got an error. Error occurred pre-rendering page dashboard. Type error cannot read properties of null reading ID. Now I'll be honest with you, this is a weird error and this error in theory shouldn't even happen. But they try to tell us that this user ID could be not defined. This is not true in theory because we have our middleware and our middleware, I guess, protects these routes. Nevertheless, TypeScript tries to tell us that, hey, it could be not defined. It will be defined. The only reason why it could not be defined is if you go to your middleware and if you add right here your /dashboard. I guess that's in security prevention. Meaning right here we can say, hey, this could be optional, even though it won't be optional. So you do that with this question mark and you do that before the dot. And with that we now say, hey, the ID could be not defined, but we actually know that it's kind of defined. Yeah. So at the end of the day, we just try to make right here Next.js and Vercel happy. So now this is added. Let's open our terminal again. Let's do git add everything with a dot. Let's do git commit -m. Let's say, I don't know, added question mark, I guess. Let's click on enter and then let's do git push. This will now push our code to GitHub and this will also redeploy our application. And as you now see, our deployment or our build has been successful. Now, right here, our logs are actually quite interesting. Let's look at them in detail. So right here we have our application, right? And then we have our index page, we have our API route, our dashboard, our create route, and the post ID route. And right here, they also show you that all of these routes are dynamic, meaning they are server rendered on demand. As mentioned, Next.js works very heavily with cache, meaning Next.js offers both dynamic rendering on the server side and also static rendering. This means your application is pre-rendered on the server side and then at the end stored in a CDN. A CDN is globally distributed around the world, meaning close to your user. If your user is in India, then this application, your static route, will be rendered super fast. If your user is in America, again, this static route will be rendered very quickly, very fast. But here's now the thing. Our index page, okay, this is dynamic, I guess. Our dashboard, yeah, I guess it's dynamic. But for example, our dashboard create route, this should be static, right? We don't really fetch any data inside of there. And our index page could also be in theory static. We can make it static and we can just revalidate the cache every minute or so. Because as an example, let's open my website, janmarshall.com, and right here you'll see these two cards are fetched from my database, right? Meaning these two courses, they are fetched from my database, which would probably mean that they are dynamic, right? No, this is actually statically rendered. I fetch my data from a CDN and I revalidate these two cards every, I think, 6 hours or so, meaning this website is super fast, as you see. So you know what, let me show it to you. Let me open the inspector, not this, but I want to open my inspector. Then if I go to the network and now, for example, go to my index page, you'll see right here a network request. This is our React server component. This is a React server component. And inside of here, you'll see inside of my headers that we have a cache hit. So where is it? Right here, X Vercel cache hit. So this whole website, this whole index page is cached, even though this data comes from the server side. The same is true for my courses. This is also, at the end of the day, data which comes from a database, but I cache it with, I think, a timestamp or a revalidation time of 1 hour or so, meaning every hour I revalidate the data. I go to my database, I get new data, and I again send it to my CDN. And now I want to do the same thing for our application. So let's first of all open our application. So if you go to your project, you can now open the domain, and here we have our application. This was our Suspense fallback, and then we have our cards. And also you'll see that currently our sign up and login buttons don't really work. So if I click on sign up, we will get redirected. That's fine. I can continue with Google. So let me continue. And as you now see, I got an error. That's because Kind now redirected me to localhost 3000. This is the redirect URI, which is currently in the Kind dashboard. So we will also have to update that. Nevertheless, let's first of all fix our cache problem, even though it's not really a cache problem. Nevertheless, let's first of all again go to the documentation, because I think some people are still confused. So Next.js improves your application's performance and reduces costs by caching rendering work and data requests. So right here you'll see, by default, Next.js will cache as much as possible to improve performance and reduce cost. This means routes are statically rendered and data requests are cached unless you opt out. Right here they also have a diagram where they show you how the cache works both on the client side and server side, because you have server cache and you have client side cache. we want to now implement client-side cache because we want to render routes which are statically rendered, which are cached and then rendered statically. And right here you'll also see caching behavior changes depending on whether the route is statically or dynamically rendered. Data is cached or uncached, and whether a request is part of an initial visit or in subsequent navigation. Depending on your use case, you can configure the caching behavior for the individual routes and data requests. So here's the thing, Next.js is relatively smart. This means when you build your application, Next.js analyzes all routes and chooses between dynamic and static rendering. So right here, Next.js would look at our page.tsx and it would see, hey, inside of here the user fetches data, which means we will now automatically opt into dynamic rendering, zero cache. But for example, it would also look at our creation route. So if I go to my dashboard and to our create route, Next.js would see, okay, the user does not fetch any data inside of here, which means we can render this route statically. But as you saw from our build logs, this route was actually not cached. This route is rendered dynamically. This is weird. This should be rendered statically, automatically, without me doing anything. What's the problem? So the problem is actually our navbar. So as you all know, we have our navbar. In our navbar, we get our user session from the server side, right? We use the getKind server session hook, and this getKind server session hook exposes a getUser function. The getUser function runs on the server side. We fetch data from the database, from kind at the end of the day. And this navbar is rendered in our layout. And here's the thing, our layout is rendered on every route, or in every route. We render our navbar in the index page, in the dashboard route, in the creation route. We rendered in every route. And since Next.js analyzes every route, it will see, oh hey, we have the navbar. And the navbar fetches the user session from the server side. This means all of the children will now be also automatically, at the end of the day, dynamically rendered. But that's not what we want. So how can we fix it? Well, you can fix it by fetching our user session on the client side. And that's what I do for my website, janmarshall.com. You see right here, if I do a hard refresh, we have a little delay, and then you see my logo right here. That's because I fetch the user session on the client side. And with that, I don't change the rendering status, that's how I will call it, of my children. So my about route is in static route. But if I would fetch my user session from the server side, this about route would be rendered dynamically. But since I fetch my user session from the client side, my about route is now statically rendered. And that's the same concept for this application. Our navbar fetches the user from the server side. This navbar is rendered on all routes, which means all of the children also become dynamically rendered on the server side, so on request level. This makes your application a bit slower, but this guarantees always fresh data. But again, our creation route does not fetch any data, which means at the end of the day, there's no fresh data to be fetched, if you understand what I mean. So let's go to our navbar, and instead of using the getKind server session hook, we can use the use browser client hook provided by kind OSS kind of Next.js. Then as you see, we currently get an error and it says this hook cannot be called in an async function. So let's delete the async modifier and let's mark the component as use client. So this error now goes away, and now we have one error for await. So await expressions are only allowed within async functions, meaning let's delete the await modifier. Let's test out if everything still works. So let me open my terminal. Let's restart our dev server with pnpm run dev, and let's again open localhost 3000. As you now see, if I do a hard refresh, we first of all show the login and sign out or sign up button, but then once we fetch our user session, we show my name and the logout button. So now instead of getting our session at the end of the day from the server side, we now get it using the client side. This is still safe to do so. We don't leak anything. This is fine. And now we can deploy our application again. So let's open our terminal. I will stop my dev server and let's do git add everything within dot, git commit -m, and then for the message, let's say getting session from client. Let's click on enter and let's do git push. This will push our code to GitHub, and then also Vercel will automatically rebuild our application. And as you now see, our application has been deployed, and if you now look at the build logs, you'll see something interesting. So the F again stands for dynamic, this means server rendered on demand, and this O, the circle, stands for pre-rendered as static content. And now you'll see something interesting. So our index page is pre-rendered as static content. Our dashboard creation route is also pre-rendered as static content. Which means instead of now rendering everything from the server side on demand, we now pre-rendered. So we pre-rendered when we built our application, and then we serve the content using our CDN, which guarantees a very fast request. So let's open our application. And if I now do a hard refresh, you see this route is super quick. Right now, it will be cached forever. That's not what we want. We want to, at the end of the day, give it like a revalidation period. So we could say, hey, let's revalidate the data every 30 days or every 30 minutes or every minute. So let's again go back to our page.tsx, and then above our async function, we can add a revalidation timestamp. So you can do an export constant revalidate, and then you set it equal to the time frame in seconds. As an example, 60 seconds. This would now mean that at the end of the day, you would now store all of your data in a CDN, and then every 60 seconds, you would revalidate your CDN with new data. Because if a user creates a new blog article, you want to, of course, show it right here. And to do that, you want to revalidate your CDN every X amount of seconds. In this case, we use 60 seconds. For my website, I use, I think, 7,200 seconds. So you can change it to your liking. Also, one thing is, if you now open your dashboard and if you create a blog article, it won't show up automatically right here. This is of course not a great user experience. This means whenever you update your blog article or whenever you create a new blog article, you want to revalidate your cache. So if you open your actions file, we have our server action, which is handle submission. Here we create our blog article, which is great, and then we redirect the user to the dashboard route. But now, before we even redirect the user to the dashboard route, I want to first of all revalidate my cache again. So above the redirect, we can do a revalidate path. This function is imported from Next.js, and we want to revalidate our index page. So here's how our code will now work. Our index page is now statically rendered. We revalidate our cache every 60 seconds. Nevertheless, I want to also revalidate our cache whenever we create a new blog article. That's why we use the revalidate path function inside of our server action to revalidate this specific path when the new blog article is created. And of course, you can also revalidate multiple paths, like for example, your dashboard and then some other route. But in this case, this does not make any sense. Our dashboard is rendered dynamically. There's no cache to be revalidated. So we want to only revalidate our index page. Let's now save this. Let's open our terminal. And inside of here, we can do in git add everything with a dot. Let's do in git commit. Let's create a message. I will say finished cache. And let's click on enter. And let's do in git push to push our code. Vercel will now automatically rebuild our application, so let's wait for that. Okay, so our application has been built successfully, and inside of here you again see all of our routes. So again, our index page is rendered statically, our not found route is rendered statically, our dashboard is rendered dynamically, our route handler is rendered dynamically, our slug route is also rendered dynamically. Now here's the thing, you can also render the post ID route statically, this works, but it works a bit differently. So for our page.tsx, we just added an export constant revalidate 60, and with that we now revalidate our index page every 60 seconds. If you now added this to the ID route, this won't work. And that's because you use params, as you see right here. We get our params, we await our params, and then we fetch our data. So to allow your ID route to be rendered statically, you have to generate static params. So the generate static params function can be used in combination with dynamic route segments to statically generate routes at build time instead of on-demand request time. So if I would now push this code with the export constant revalidate 60, this website, or this route would still be rendered dynamically. So to render it statically, we have to generate this function and statically generate our params to allow static pre-rendering. But for this video, we don't have to do that. It's fine without that. And now we want to allow our user to finally sign in. So for that, let's first of all head over to Kind. So I'm now in my business, as you see, and inside of here we have our application, our Next.js application. Let's click on View Details. Let's scroll a bit to the bottom, and inside of here we now have our allowed callback URL and our allowed logout redirect URL. Let's copy our production URL. So this is my production URL, and then I can click on Enter and paste it inside of here. Now please make sure that you delete the slash at the end. That's super important. And let's also paste our URL for the allowed callback URL. Right here I have to also append /API/auth/kind callback. So now in our allowed callback URL and in our allowed logout redirect URL, we have two URLs, one for localhost 3000 and one for our production URL. And again, please make sure that you delete the slash at the end. And now we can save this, and we want to now head over to Vercel. Then in Vercel, let's go to our application, let's go to the settings, let's go to our environment variables, and we want to update our environment variables. So first of all, I want to update my kind site URL. Let's click on Edit, and instead of passing localhost 3000, I want to pass my production URL. So let's copy it and let's paste it inside of here. Please make sure that you delete the slash at the end. Let's save it. And then I want to also update my kind post logout redirect URL. Let me paste my production URL. I will delete the slash at the end. Again, super important. And then let's also do the same for the kind post login redirect URL. Let's paste our production URL, and this will be /dashboard. Okay, let's now save this. We have now updated our environment variables, and to propagate them, we want to now redeploy our application. So let's go to deployments, let's click on the three dots, and then I want to click on redeploy, and yes, I want to redeploy this. This will now redeploy our application with the new environment variables. So our application has now been deployed, which is great. And now instead of logging in our initial account, so this account where I created all of my blog articles, let's sign up with a new account. So I will click on sign up. As you now see, I got redirected. Let me continue with Google. And now I signed up with a completely new account. As you see on the top corner, John. I'm not John, but who cares? And as you see, we don't have any blog articles. So let's create our first article. Let me click on create post. As you see, the navigation was instant. That's because this route is pre-rendered as static content. For the title, hey, this, I don't know, is an article from John. Then for the content, hey, this is super cool, damn. And then for the image, I will just copy paste it, and then let me click on submit. We now have our pending state, as you see, and we will now get redirected to our dashboard. In our dashboard, we now see our article, which is nice. We have the title, description, the image, we have the name, when it was created. And if I go to my home page now, we should also see it inside of here. And yes, that's what we have. We have John with the new article. As you see, this is not ordered by the created at timestamp. Yeah, this was a mistake. So if you want to, you can open your code base, and then in your page.tsx, you can do an order by, and then you can order by the created at timestamp and set it to descending, meaning that you get the newest results first. But I guess in this case it does not really matter. Alright friends, we are now kinda finished with this video. We have covered all of the core concepts of Next.js, and let's go through them again quickly. We have covered what Next.js is and why you should use it. We have covered how to install Next.js. We know how the project directory looks like. We also understand the basics of routing, normal routes, dynamic routes. We know how to navigate to a route using the link component. We understand the difference between client components and server components. We have also looked at mutations using server actions. We have quickly looked at route handlers with kind. We learned about authentication with kind and how to authorize users using middleware so that no unauthenticated users are able to, at the end of the day, view the dashboard and view the creation route. We have also secured our server actions because, again, server actions are public endpoints. We looked at Suspense and streaming. As you saw, it was very easy to implement using the loading file or even with the native Suspense components. Then we have also looked at deployment with Vercel, and as you saw, deployment was also super simple. And yeah, now we are finished with this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you kind for making this video possible. And now I hope you enjoy your day, and I hope I can see you in the next video. See you soon. Bye.